The 3D Zelda series includes some of the most influential and important video games of all time. It was there to shape the 3D adventure genre, as well as redefine it throughout the years. The Zelda series has consistently introduced innovative gameplay mechanics and puzzles that challenge players' problem-solving skills. The combination of action, exploration, and puzzle solving creates a unique and engaging experience which keeps each entry remaining infinitely replayable. While there are tons of things to enjoy about this series, that doesn't mean that it's completely flawless. So in this video, I want to take a bigger look at every single 3D Zelda game in the series in order to determine what makes them so special, but also to identify the problems that they all present as well. Even a beloved franchise such as this one has its flaws. So with all that said, I hope you enjoy an in-depth retrospective of the entire 3D Zelda series, beginning with the game that started it all, Ocarina of Time. We live in a world which now contains millions of video games from many different developers and companies. And whether they be innovative or downright horrible, very few of those games have been capable of standing the test of time for decades on end. However, with the introduction of the Nintendo 64, there came a slew of brand new ideas and concepts no one had ever seen before. This is obviously due to the N64 being one of the first ever 3D consoles, so all eyes were on Nintendo to see what they could create. And after Super Mario 64 seamlessly transitioned Mario into a 3D environment with fantastic controls and an innovative new camera feature, fans from all over the globe were clamoring for the Zelda series to receive the same treatment that Mario was given back in 1996. Well, in 1998, after 2 long years of waiting, they would finally get their wish with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. So the goal was clear from the start. How do you transition something as perfect as A Link to the Past into an expansive and fully open 3D world for the player to explore? And I use A Link to the Past as an example here because many like to refer to Ocarina of Time as a 3D version of that game. And they certainly aren't wrong, from a certain perspective. These two titles share many of the same design elements, such as dungeons, similar enemies, and a wide variety of NPCs to talk to. So therefore, my goal in this video is to further show how Ocarina of Time took the formula from A Link to the Past and completely perfected all of its concepts for the next generation. So let's take a journey back to the golden age of video games, back to the Nintendo 64 era. Immediately after starting the game, we are given some quick dialogue before being thrust into Link's nightmare. This dream of his is foreshadowing what's to come later on in the game. We are then introduced to Navi through the Great Deku Tree warning Navi about the fate of Hyrule, if she doesn't seek out Link. So obviously, she's going to look for Link, and I'm going to take a moment to highlight how brilliant this opening is. We are taken into a first-person perspective of Navi's view as she flies around the Kokiri Forest searching for Link. This is a subtle way of showing off the village without taking away any of its magic because it's so fast-paced. After this, she finds Link and wakes him up, allowing the player to finally take control. Kokiri Forest is an absolutely perfect introduction, as it not only teaches us everything we need to know about the movement and controls, but it does all of this without seeming like a tutorial at all. There are people to talk to, platforms to run around on, and eventually you'll stumble upon this boulder maze, which leads you to your first item in the game, the Kokiri Sword. And once you obtain this weapon, if you notice the blades of grass placed throughout the forest and decide to cut them, you'll be given some rupees, and these are important as Link can't see the Great Deku Tree until he has a sword and shield, which must be bought from the store for 40 rupees. Collecting the money necessary for the sword is completely doable, however, as long as you thoroughly explore the village. But after this is completed, you'll meet one of the most unlikable characters in the game, that of course being Mido, this little elf-looking dude. He'll start pestering you about having a sword and shield before he allows you to speak with the Deku Tree. but once Link shows this stuff off to him, you'll be granted access outside of the starting area. It is here where you encounter the first enemy in the game, a Deku Baba. They can't move at all, their only attack being to lunge forward at Link, and if defeated, you're rewarded with the Deku Stick, which will come in handy later. So once you finally reach the Deku Tree, he explains how a parasite has fallen upon him, and that it must be destroyed. This gives us access to our first child dungeon in the game, the Great Deku Tree. So since this is the very first dungeon in the game, it is clearly going to be very easy, and mainly serve the function of getting the player accustomed to how a 3D environment works. As you may have noticed, this dungeon is incredibly vertical, and this was done to show how Ocarina of Time has advanced from the 2D Zelda titles, because climbing a giant tree like this was certainly not possible until now. Once you learn how to climb some vines and open doors, the room containing the first item is accessible. This is where you obtain the slingshot, and I like how, once acquiring this item, the player is forced to look around their environment, so you notice a ladder that must be shot down with the slingshot in order to progress. Games didn't really do that at the time, and even today it's difficult to find games that pull off tutorials like this so perfectly. At the very top of the tree, there aren't any doors remaining, so the game asks the player to use their spatial awareness and discover that Link can jump and break through the web here, bringing him to the lower section of the dungeon. Now this is where all the gold Skulltulas are introduced. They function as a way of giving the player a completely optional collectible, which will directly benefit their arsenal once a certain amount of them are collected. These can be used to upgrade your wallet size, as well as rewarding Link with other treasures. But back to the dungeon, it is here on this lower level that we need to light a Deku Stick on fire to progress through this web and continue on through the dungeon. Again, the Great Deku Tree is very simple, so while these puzzles may look extremely easy to us now, they were genius during the time this game was created, as many people were still getting used to this brand new way of gaming. The rest of this place is more or less the same, but it also introduces swimming controls, and minor block pushing puzzles that get pretty frustrating later on in the game. Even the boss fight was very smartly constructed, as it won't automatically start or anything like that. You actually need to look up in first person mode to notice this giant creature known as Queen Goma crawling around on the ceiling. And once you do this, the fight begins. It's very simple, mainly just requiring the slingshot is used on her eyeball to take her down, so Link can wail on her with this tiny sword. So yeah, after she is defeated, you're given the very first heart container in the game, and taken outside where the Great Deku Tree is waiting to tell you that your efforts were great, but the parasite is still destroying him. He is still dying, and we must seek out Princess Zelda in order to better understand what is required of us, and to save Hyrule. But before we leave, Saria here has a nice little gift for us, her wooden ocarina. This is the main gimmick of the game, of course, and I personally love it because Koji Kondo, being the musical genius he is, was somehow able to craft several different songs that all sound amazing, using only 5 notes. Alright, now it's finally time to cross Hyrule Field, and okay, never mind. We must sit here and listen to this lovely tuner give us advice we don't need, only to ask us if we want to hear his words again. No. Hyrule Field is pretty interesting, mainly due to the fact that it has nothing going on at all. It's super bare and hardly contains anything in it to make it fun. It usually just ends up being a chore as you roll your way around to your next destination. But you know what? That's totally okay. After all, this was the very first 3D Zelda game, and even though it may be vast and empty, this rendition of Hyrule Field is very respectable, because the team clearly tried hard to make every location coexist with one another. Because if there's one thing this area has going for it, it's how seamless the whole world feels. Alright, so making your way through Castle Town, there's a stealth section that shortly follows. There's a bunch of guards standing around, and there's this one path I've always taken to avoid them, but I'm not sure if there's any other way. After that, this game highlights one of the biggest reasons I love it so much. That being the characters. For a Nintendo 64 game, it sure does a great job at giving all the citizens of the world a ton of charm like we see here with Talon. He's being lazy and his daughter Malon is on the other side of the field all frustrated because he's forgotten about her again. It's little touches like these that really pull a world together for me and make each playthrough memorable, thus creating a more enjoyable experience. So after this, we are taken to yet another stealth section and it's pretty short. However, completing that brings you to the castle where Link finally meets with Zelda. She tells you a bunch of stuff the Deku Tree already did, mainly just exposition as to how Hyrule was created by the goddesses. She then goes on to explain her plot to take down Ganon, and we all know how that ended for her. Impa teaches us our first song on the ocarina after this, which is called Zelda's Lullaby. You may recognize the tune as one of the most beloved songs in Zelda history, and it all stemmed from A Link to the Past back on the Super Nintendo. This is when the journey actually begins. We're given instructions to go to Kakariko Village, which is definitely the coziest place in the game. You can collect a few gold skulltulas here, and even grab the Hylian shield from a graveyard if you decide to go graveyard digging. There's also this one heart piece I always cheat my way through. I mean, it's way more fun than using the hookshot as intended, so I do it this way. Now after giving this guard a letter from Zelda, it's onward to Death Mountain, the home of the Gorons. Here, Link meets with this grumpy old hermit named Darunia. He's all angry because his precious rocks are gone, and decides to take that anger out on poor Link over here. In order to put him in a good mood again, Link needs to learn a song from Saria, who's waiting for him in the Sacred Forest Meadow. Can I just say that this is one of those things that if you're a little kid playing the game, I feel like would be impossible to figure out on your own. I mean, I had a hard time figuring this out as a teenager my first time through, but I suppose that's how many classic games were back in the day. Cryptic, but the enjoyable type of way. Once we make it past the forest meadow, Saria will teach us her song. And can you guess what it's called? Playing this song in front of Darunia will suddenly put him in the world's greatest mood, and he will give us this bracelet that allows Link to pick up bomb flowers and use them as a temporary placeholder for the real bombs, which are obtained in the second dungeon. They're kind of like training wheels. They make you feel pretty useless and lame. Like, just give me my big boy bombs. Come on, he's old enough to handle them. Link is 10 years old. Dodongo's Cavern is the second child dungeon, and its central theme is the bomb flowers. Basically, most puzzles here require some minor form of bomb usage, and I like this area here, where you gotta wait to throw the bomb until it's about to explode. Otherwise, Link can't proceed. It's a good reminder to the player that they can't just chuck around bombs left and right, and expect everything to just blow up automatically. Honestly, this is probably the least remarkable dungeon in the game. It's not bad, but there really isn't much to it. The coolest part of it is definitely when you have to throw 2 bombs down into the skeleton's eye sockets so that way he drops his jaw, which grants Link access to the final room, where you really just have to make your way around this area to the other side, where you can push a block onto a switch to open up the final door. King Dodongo is the boss fight here, and like any other Zelda boss, he's super formulaic, as you just wait till he opens his mouth, then throw a bomb in it, and go to town with your dinky little Kokiri sword. After he's destroyed, Darunia gets all lovey with Link, calling him his brother and giving him the Goron's Rupee. So that's 2 of the 3 necessary trinkets to unlock the Door of Time. The last main location for now is Zora's Domain. Here you can compete in this little minigame where you collect a bunch of rupees underwater, and succeeding in this will grant Link the ability to hold his breath longer than 3 seconds underwater, which is needed to collect this bottle with a letter from Princess Ruto inside. Showing this to her father will cause him to move for the first time in God only knows how long. Now it's up to the player to realize that they need to go back and collect a fish so Jabu Jabu can eat it and inhale Link into his belly, which is also the 3rd dungeon. I never liked this place when I was younger. It always confused me and I spent hours trying to figure out what to do. But as I've grown older, this area has definitely become pretty enjoyable to me, because I find it really relaxing and laid back. You just carry Ruto around, and you can even throw her at enemies to defeat them. She is a spoiled brat though, like seriously the most entitled little headache in the Zelda franchise. Oh wait. The mini-boss here drives me insane because you can't cut corners even though it seems like the most natural solution to taking it down. No, you need to awkwardly throw your boomerang or Deku Nuts at it to even get close enough to cause any damage. It's harder than the actual boss itself. Oh yeah, you get the boomerang here in this dungeon by defeating these weird little flying things. I have no idea what they're called, but nevertheless, obtaining the boomerang gives Link the solution to defeating these parasites in each room. And once they're all gone, you can fall down this hole that was previously blocked off. I like this puzzle. It tests the player to see if they were actually paying attention earlier to the blocked off area, and it creates a satisfying feeling if you actually manage to do this correctly, especially on the first try. The boss here is a pretty big step up in difficulty compared to the last 2 dungeons. It actually has multiple phases and mainly tests the player on their mastery over the movement of Link. It's also got a sick death animation. But once that's over, Ruto finally stops being an entitled brat and hands over the final gemstone to Link, the Zora Sapphire. I didn't mention the Great Fairies earlier, but after completing certain areas, you can use an item to find an entrance into the Great Fairy Fountains. These are super surreal areas, almost feeling like they are located in an entirely different dimension. These fairies bestow upon Link magical upgrades that will actually help a great deal in certain situations. These are another super creative and unique addition to the Zelda series that everyone loves. So before heading back to the Temple of Time with your gemstones, make sure to head over to Lon Lon Ranch because there are a couple great things to do here. For one, there's this mini game with Talon where Link needs to find 3 random Cuckoos, and if successful, he's given a bottle with milk, which is a great reward in any Zelda game. But obviously the main attraction here for Link is his horse, Epona. You need to learn Epona's song as a child so you can actually see her as an adult, which I'll touch upon later. Now that that's over, go back to the castle entrance and Link's nightmare from the start of the game becomes fully realized. He even attempts to look strong here in front of Ganon with his useless little knife, but he just gets owned, of course. Silly Link, you're not strong enough for Ganon yet. Anyways, Zelda will throw the Ocarina of Time into the castle's moat, and after collecting this, she teaches Link the Song of Time, which is only really used for moving these big blocks throughout dungeons. But its other function is to open the Door of Time, which turns out was Ganon's plan all along. You see, he wanted Link to open the door so he could slip inside the Sacred Realm and rule over Hyrule. But hey, at least Link gets a cool new sword out of the deal. That alone makes up for the tragedies Ganon will wreak upon Hyrule, right? After getting the Master Sword, this old man reveals to Link that he is aged 7 years and is now old enough to wield the blade he now has sheathed upon his back. I remember the most mind-blowing thing about all this to me was hearing how Link sounded as an adult. Like, oh yeah, Link's grown now, he can do things he wasn't able to do as a child. Alright, so before leaving the Temple of Time, Sheik is introduced as this really mysterious Sheikah warrior, and it adds a lot of depth to this character not knowing who he is or what his intentions are. All we know is he wants to help Link retake Hyrule, and says that he should head over to Kakariko Village and find the hookshot next. But before you do that, go back to Lon Lon Ranch and talk to this lovely fellow. He'll make you pay rupees just to ride around for a little bit. But if you call over Epona and ride around for a little bit while jumping over these fences to collect rupees, Ingo will challenge Link to a race, and if Link wins, Ingo gets all mad and demands a rematch. And if you win that race, he locks you in the ranch with Epona. Not knowing that we can literally go jump over this fence here and officially claim Epona as our own. So now head over to Kakariko Graveyard and pull back this tombstone right here. Dompe, the gravekeeper from earlier, is now a ghost and challenges Link to a race. Why does everyone want to race Link? This can actually be kinda tough if you're not careful because Dompe moves pretty fast, and if you lose him, the whole race restarts. But winning this race forces Dompe to concede, rewarding Link with the hookshot, which is now how the first adult temple is accessed. It's time for a trip back to Kokiri Forest and through the Lost Woods again, as you need to travel through the Sacred Forest Meadow while dealing with these very frustrating moblins. They keep knocking me into the water. I was getting pretty upset over these giant pit bulls with spears, but making it through this area will cause Sheik to appear again, teaching Link the Minuet of Forest. This gives us the ability to warp back here whenever we want, even though there really isn't any use for it. Alright, now we can use our hookshot right here, and it's into the Forest Temple we go. This is one of, if not the most popular dungeons in Zelda history, and I have to agree, it is pretty cool. The music really sells the atmosphere, and the puzzles are actually really confusing and well crafted in most cases. This is also the first time keys are introduced, and it feels almost like the game is telling you that you aren't a kid anymore. And just like the real world, things are going to get much crazier and more difficult. The Forest Temple genuinely gives off an eerie vibe, like the whole thing is super dark, and you spend most of it trying to hunt down these Poes. And in order to do that, you need the bow, which is rewarded after defeating these Stalfos here. This enemy in particular is frustrating because they block almost all of Link's attacks and basically just require you to wait until they make a move before you can cause any damage to them. The bow is used to solve a variety of puzzles in this temple. As stated earlier, the only way to defeat the Poe sisters is by using your bow on them. They aren't difficult to defeat at all because I'm not sure if many people know this, But just throw a Deku Note at them once they turn invisible, and it automatically forces the Poe to come out of hiding, which gives you plenty of chances to destroy them with the bow. The other main gimmick here is this eyeball, that one shot with the bow can either twist or straighten out this corridor. This is required to find the boss key and the small keys hidden within these few rooms. And to me, this is the most confusing part of the dungeon. I always forget something integral such as twisting one of the corridors again, or skipping a small key. But after all the Poes are defeated, you can head back to the main lobby, and this is where the mini-boss takes place, which isn't too difficult at all. Just look for the Poe that spins, and shoot them a few times with the bow. In doing so will grant access to the lowest part of the temple, which is also where the boss room is. But before you can fight the boss, these pillars must be pushed in order to change the layout of the room, so that way the boss door is finally opened up. I like how the 3DS version included these paintings along the walls of the hallway leading up to the door. It's a nice touch and breathes more life into the dungeon. Okay, so Phantom Ganon is who Link needs to battle here, and for some reason on my most recent playthrough, I struggled so much with him. At least in his first phase, you have to look around these paintings to see if the real Ganon can be identified, and this can definitely be tricky and time consuming. The second phase is a subtle foreshadowing to the final fight with Ganon himself, where you have to play energy tennis with him in order to knock him down so Link can attack him with his sword. So yeah, a pretty cool dungeon to say the least, and I can totally see why people always consider this their favorite temple in the game. Completing the 4th temple takes us back to the Sacred Realm, where it is revealed that Saria was actually the sage here. I find this kind of weird because we see her briefly in the very beginning of the game, but not again until Link becomes an adult and completes one temple. Anyways, the next dungeon can actually be accessed immediately. However, one thing that is required is a Goron tunic, which obviously protects Link from fire. And the best way to get this is by bombing this tiny little Goron who's rolling about. But hold on, because this is Darunia's son, and he explains to us that we need to enter the Fire Temple and slay Volvagia in order to rescue the entire Goron tribe. He then gives Link the fire-resistant tunic, and I just head straight for the dungeon, but Sheik stops us here to teach Link the Bolero of Fire, and it's just another warp song in case we ever need to come back to this area. I'm just gonna get this out of the way now, but Sheik shows up before every temple to show Link a new song, which can then be used to teleport him to said temple. So now that we have that, it's time for my personal favorite dungeon in the game, the Fire Temple. I bet you didn't hear that hot take very often, I just absolutely love the core concept here. The main goal is to travel throughout the dungeon, freeing any Goron you come across. And the reason I love this so much is because it's genuinely fulfilling to rescue each and every Goron from the tribe. You feel like you're actually restoring Hyrule back to its former days, piece by piece. I also love the music here. And as you'll come to find out, each song perfectly fits the atmosphere it was created for. It really shows the brilliance of Koji Kondo, that he was able to perfectly craft songs for each atmosphere in the game, and he knew that since songs played within each dungeon would likely be on for at least 30 minutes to an hour, they had to be low-key, ambient pieces to really sell the mood. And he captures it perfectly every time. So back to the dungeon itself, you get the Megaton Hammer here, which is probably the most underutilized item in the game, as it's really only used to smash a few blocks here and there. Obviously it's used the most here in the Fire Temple, and mainly just serves as a tool for unlocking more ways to save the Gorons. You fight Volvagia here, as stated earlier. He's a big dragon creature that flies around, and the room you fight him in is super cool. Everything here is just so red, but it looks amazing, and besides the final fight in the game, this is probably the most cinematic encounter Link faces. As you'd expect, Darunia is the sage of the Fire Temple, and by saving his tribe you're rewarded with his medallion. Okay, so this is the part of the game where I always do the big Goron trading quest, mainly because I hate fighting Dark Link without it, but this quest holds a special place in my heart for me, because something about it is really cozy. It starts off so chill, with having to use a chicken to once again wake up Talon. And just a quick side note, do not try this side quest without Epona, because you will fail and waste your time. Especially later on when you have to run all the way from Lake Hylia to Death Mountain, and these two locations are literally on complete opposite sides of the map from each other. But go for this side quest because the reward is phenomenal. The Big Goron Sword does twice as much damage as the Master Sword and can easily defeat almost any enemy in the game within 1 to 2 hits. Before you can enter the Water Temple, you need to acquire the Iron Boots from the Ice Cavern. This is kind of like a child dungeon because there are no small keys, and it takes much less time to complete it than it does for the other temples. It's super beautiful here though. Every shade of blue used is so vibrant, and the music is absolute perfection here too. It is now that you realize it would be nice to have more than one bottle if you want to avoid depression by constantly walking back to get this blue fire. You can even find a heart piece here, and it's probably the easiest one in the entire game. The last puzzle in the ice cavern is this block pushing puzzle, but it's actually not too bad at all. And after this, you're taken into by far the most gorgeous room in the game, where you fight this one pathetic Wolfos, which unlocks the chest containing the iron boots. Sheik then shows up, teaching us a serenade of water, which will teleport Link to the water temple's location. I love the cinematic here. The camera pans around the room and shows off these beautiful set pieces. Before you leave the ice cavern, make sure to take the blue fire with you, so you can unfreeze King Zora. This is because he will also give you a free tunic, that being the Zora tunic, which allows Link to breathe underwater and obviously comes in handy with the water temple. Speaking of which, now that you've obtained the iron boots, you can head over to the water temple. Ah, here we go. This dungeon has obviously seen a lot of hate from players since its release back in 1998, but recently, it seems to be getting more praise than ever before. I think the 3DS version of Ocarina of Time played a huge role in this, partially because the updates made to the temple itself, along with the much needed quality of life feature, turning the iron boots into an item rather than a piece of clothing like it was before. Now you can just click a button and instantly wear the boots, rather than being forced into the menu every few seconds just to put them on and take them off. But besides that, the water temple is a pretty great dungeon actually. It really tests the player's memory and requires tons of backtracking by raising and lowering the water levels in order to uncover the many small keys hidden throughout. And the mini-boss here is also perhaps the most memorable fight in any Zelda game up to this point. And I honestly can't see why. It seems the only reason people love this encounter is because it's Dark Link, and he obviously looks cool. He's like an evil reflection of Link. But if we're taking the actual mechanics of the fight itself into consideration, this is actually a very poorly constructed battle. Simply because rather than being an AI, Dark Link just mirrors your every move, which can lead to tons of glitches. Needless to say, I used a big Goron sword on him. Goodbye. We're now given the long shot, which is just an extended version of the hook shot. It's still pretty fun though, as it can be used to reach faraway objects, and I also always loved just sending Link flying around. However, the rest of the water temple mainly involves trying to find the boss key, and once you do, this temple is finally over, and we get to the worst boss fight in the game, Morpha. This is such a lame fight coming off this huge dungeon we just completed. You literally just stand there and yank out the amiibo with the long shot, so you can then whack it with the sword. Problem solved. Princess Ruto is a sage of the water temple, and after giving Link the medallion, it's time to move on to the next dungeon. Or it would be, but we have to head over to Kakariko Village with Sheik and get harassed by this giant invisible creature. It's actually a pretty cool cutscene though, and after it, Sheik teaches us our next warp song, the Nocturne of Shadow. And before we can tackle the Shadow Temple, we have to learn the Song of Storms with adult Link, so we can then go back in time and play it in the windmill with child Link, in order to drain the well where the Eye of Truth is located. Enter the bottom of the well. This is another mini dungeon, kinda like the Ice Cavern, where there are no small keys, but unlike the serene and peaceful Ice Cavern, this place is horrifying. There are tons of things to do here, such as finding secrets in gold skulltulas, but I always just go straight over here, play Zelda's Lullaby, so that way I can access the boss. Dead Hand, the most horrifying Zelda enemy ever, is who Link must fight if he wants the Eye of Truth. And it can actually be pretty difficult since you're a child and have to deal with that dinky Kokiri sword again. Nevertheless, Dead Hand is an awesome looking enemy and poses a real threat. So now that you've obtained the Eye of Truth, play the Nocturne of Shadow, which will take you over to the entrance of the Shadow Temple. Then, using Din's fire on this platform will finally open up the door to the Shadow Temple. And oh man, I love this dungeon. It's literally a torture chamber for all the enemies of the royal family, and it truly feels like you're going to be attacked in every direction by something, just based off the music and atmosphere alone. And that's not to mention all the guillotines and other atrocities you'll find here. So as I mentioned earlier, the Eye of Truth is needed here. Well, not 100% needed, but unless you want to aimlessly walk around for hours, it's very smart that you have it, so you can easily find your way through the dungeon. The main item here is the hover boots, which are for some reason given to the player almost immediately upon entering the Shadow Temple. To get them, all you have to do is defeat another Dead Hand. And these are much more fun to use than the iron boots, because with the hover boots, Link gets all floaty and slippery, and it's fun to try and control him like this. This dungeon is also incredibly linear, but for some reason, it feels super long. I don't know if it's just me, but it feels like it goes on forever. However, personally, the best part of the Shadow Temple is this ferry ride where you fight a couple Stalfos. It feels really cool and stands out a lot because this is seen nowhere else in the entire game. That's another great thing about Ocarina of Time. Each and every location feels super distinct and creative in their designs. Every dungeon seems to have something completely unique to that temple, and that's part of the reason Ocarina of Time is so enjoyable and replayable. It never gets boring because the game is constantly throwing new things at the player. Anyways, Bongo Bongo is this temple's guardian, and yet again, this is just a great fight. You have to shoot his hands with the bow, and then use the Eye of Truth to see his weak point, which is his eye. Because, you know, every Zelda game has to have one of these. But yeah, repetitive but fun battle, which utilizes more than one item, which is surprising. So for some reason, Impa is the sage here, which is cool I guess, but unexpected at least for me. I don't know why she's the sage. Probably because she's a Sheikah, but who knows. This point in the game is where the adventure truly starts to wrap up, as there is only one major dungeon left. But first we need to travel to the Gerudo Desert and tackle this little mini dungeon, which has always been super aggravating to me. Like every time you're seen by a guard, they throw you in jail, and poor Link over here just wants access to the temple. You have to swiftly make your way through this place without getting caught at all, because there's these 4 carpenters that need to be rescued for the game to progress. Stumbling upon one of these guys will initiate some dialogue, then a little fight with one of the Gerudos, and they aren't tough at all, especially with the big Oron sword. After freeing all 4 carpenters, your talents will be recognized by this lady, and she'll give you unlimited access to the Gerudo's territory, which is good because we've wasted enough time here, being violently thrown into jail, so let's move on. We have to go through this haunted wasteland by locating the nearest flag and traveling to it. This is a really cool location. I love the ambience that the wind gives off. And once you're halfway through here, Link needs to run around in circles chasing this invisible Poe with his magnifying glass to uncover the Desert Colossus. You can get Nehru's love here from the Great Fairy, which is actually pretty useful in combat against tougher enemies. But besides that, upon entering the Spirit Temple, Link is met with a dead end, so we have to exit and talk to Sheik again, who teaches us our very last song, the Requiem of Spirit. We actually have to come back here with Child Link to complete half of the dungeon. This is a really cool concept, and I'm surprised it wasn't used anywhere else in the game, considering that time travel is literally the main concept of Ocarina of Time. But the Spirit Temple is another fan favorite, and I can see why. The music here is so cool, it really sells the whole Eastern European vibe, and the enemies here can be pretty tough. However, the puzzles are definitely the best part of the Spirit Temple. Like I mentioned earlier, every dungeon in this game strives to bring totally new ideas and concepts to the table, and this temple is no exception. You get to fight these cool enemies never seen before. Well, fight would be a bit of an overstatement because you literally just use Din's fire and they are taken out in a split second. At the end of this half of the Spirit Temple, Link fights the toughest enemy in the game, an Iron Knuckle. If you get struck by one of these guys, you will be taken out, to put things lightly. They will literally send Link flying back, while also taking tons of hearts in the process, so it's best to fight the Iron Knuckles conservatively, especially as young Link. But after you beat the Iron Knuckle, Link finally finds his silver gauntlets, which were supposed to be for Naburo, but she's busy getting eviscerated, so they belong to us now. Hey, finders keepers, you gotta respect it. So now it's time for the second half of the dungeon, this time with adult Link, and now that he has the silver gauntlets, he can push this gigantic block down and proceed through the temple. This half of the temple is more or less the same as the first half. The puzzles are very similar, but still very fun to tackle. However, now that you are back to being an adult with your mighty big Oron sword, you feel like the 40-year-old on his way back to his high school football reunion. You can literally slaughter everyone here, and it just feels great having your power back. So don't take adulthood for granted. Anyways, at the end of the temple, you have to fight another Iron Knuckle, and it's the same as always, except this time, it goes down much faster because of our much better sword. However, upon defeating this Iron Knuckle, it is revealed to the player that this was actually Naburo, being brainwashed by Kotake and Koume into doing their dirty deeds. So you can probably see where things go from here. Yes, that's right. With our brand new mirror shield, we fight the 2 witches, Kotake and Koume. This is a 2-part battle that, in my opinion, goes on for a bit too long. It's still a fun boss fight, but like, okay, I get it. Just stand here with my shield out for both phases while waiting for them to shoot an element out at Link. so we can deflect it into one of the witches. There really isn't much to say here, but I do like their little dialogue at the end, which humanizes them a little bit and gives them more character. Alright, after this we finally reach the endgame, with Rauru telling us that Link must depart for Hyrule Castle. There's this really cool little cutscene where all the sages form this rainbow road looking bridge which unlocks access to Ganon's castle. This is basically just a culmination of all the previous dungeons stuffed into their own separate rooms, and they act as these little mini challenges for the player to prove that they have mastered every aspect of the game before they can move on. These rooms are interesting, and it's cool to see how some of these areas have themes mixed together, which can make for a really unique and enjoyable atmosphere. This entire section of the castle is really unnerving. The music is ominous, and there isn't a single person in sight. You really do feel like you're single-handedly responsible for saving Hyrule, and without you, the world would be completely screwed over with no hope. After completing all these rooms, the final part of the castle is unlocked, which mainly involves fighting all sorts of enemies while slowly ascending to the top of the castle. This is really neat. It adds a perfect amount of tension and anxiety, especially with how the music gets louder and louder the higher you go. For reaching the top, Link finally encounters Ganondorf for the first time as an adult. And unbeknownst to Ganon, Link is fully capable dude now, with tons of weapons in his arsenal. The fight with Ganondorf himself looks amazing, but it really isn't that special. You just sort of stand there in one place and play energy tennis with him until he gets stunned. And after using a light arrow on him, you're finally able to deal damage with your sword. After this, Ganondorf curses the whole castle and causes it to start crumbling down, which turns this section into an escape sequence. It's not too hard, and it's really cool to actually escape this place with Zelda since, you know, up until this point, Link hadn't really gotten any interaction with Zelda as an adult, so it makes for an interesting little portion. However, once Link and Zelda do escape the castle, it seems like everything is just peaches and roses. It is until you start moving towards the wreckage, and Ganondorf, in a fit of rage, emerges from the rubble and transforms into the Demon King, Ganon. I love this battle, everything about it, to its very atmospheric music, to lightning flashing across the sky. And I also recently found out that you can damage Ganon using Deku Nuts of all things. So that's pretty cool. Even though they do almost no damage at all, the main way of damaging Ganon is by rolling underneath him and slashing his tail. And this is where the Big Oron Sword comes in extra handy, because if you don't have it, things are going to be an absolute nightmare for you, as you'll have to slowly defeat him with the hammer or light arrows, since he took away Link's ability to use the Master Sword. But after enough damage has been done to him, Zelda blasts this ray of light, stunning Ganon, which gives Link the chance to grab the Master Sword and finally cut into Ganon's skull. And that's the game! The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is a perfect example of how to keep a game relevant for years on end. This game was released over 20 years ago and still has millions of people playing it from around the world, and discovering new ways to beat the game as fast as possible. Ocarina of Time really was that influential, and it literally revolutionized the way combat works in third-person adventure games. With its Z-targeting method, there truly are few games that will ever reach the amount of praise from the critics and audience alike. This is the most critically acclaimed game of all time, and it's no surprise why. Though it may be outdated in some aspects, certain things such as the combat and camera controls have continued to show up in every Zelda game since Ocarina of Time. It really is a revered classic that will always be remembered and played by thousands, and it will forever be used in examples on how to create a near-perfect video game. Thank you so much for watching. This was a big project of mine, and I'm glad to have finally been able to put it out for all of you. Cheers! Majora's Mask is one of the strangest games I've ever played. Released in the year 2000 as a follow-up to Ocarina of Time, this strange sequel would go on to shape one of the most unique experiences you can find, not only within the Zelda franchise, but within the entire gaming industry as a whole. After the release of Ocarina of Time, the director of the Zelda series, Eiji Aonuma, was hit with one of the most difficult tasks by Shigeru Miyamoto. That task being to construct an entirely new Zelda game in less than 2 years. Well, if anything, this experience just goes to show how much of a genius Aonuma really is. Why spend lots of time creating tons of new character models when you can just pull them straight from the previous game? So what did he do? Him and his team built a Zelda game which focused heavily on brand new mechanics rather than new characters, aiming to ensure that the sequel to the most critically acclaimed game of all time would live up to its legacy and status as a game in the Legend of Zelda franchise. Well, it's no surprise that Aonuma reached a seemingly impossible goal, as he not only created a great game, but a memorable experience that the fans still talk about over 20 years after its release. This is my retrospective of The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. So after entering a parallel universe to Hyrule, we're introduced to the Happy Mask Salesman, who you might remember from Ocarina of Time. This is just one of the many examples which show how brilliant it was to reuse old character models. Things you came to expect from these people in the previous game will be completely turned sideways, as we see here with the Mask Salesman. He plays a much greater role this time, but he mainly keeps his identity a secret. This game does a great job at completely obscuring the origins of both the Mask Salesman and Majora, which is genius. Sometimes, mysteries are best left unanswered, and when done correctly, this can create a powerful tool in creating speculation among the fanbase over the backstory of a certain character, such as what we see here. Anyways, after interacting with the Happy Mask Salesman, Link emerges into a seemingly normal town, but there's just one problem. This giant moon is literally going to bury this place into the ground in 3 days, and it's up to Link to eliminate not only the moon, but Majora as well. Now, one thing that's unlike any other Zelda game is you don't really start the game as Link. Almost immediately, Skull Kid turns him into a Deku Scrub, which turns the first part of the game into a mission to revert Link back to his original form. This could actually cause great confusion to players if they have never played a Zelda game before, which is why it is highly recommended that you do not play this as your first Zelda experience. Starting the game out as a Deku is basically the developers telling you to play Ocarina of Time first. Otherwise, it is very likely that someone could get stuck in this first part, never knowing what to do. And this entire game is just weird as a whole. Don't get me wrong, but literally nothing done in the beginning resembles the start to any other Zelda game at all. One of the first tasks that must be tackled is playing hide and seek with the Bomber Kids, but they don't accept Link since he's a Deku Scrub, which makes this whole thing even more difficult. Imagine it would be incredibly sad to be Link, considering he just saved Hyrule from destruction, only to end up in an alternate world where nobody knows who he is, or any of the accomplishments he's made. Link went from being the hero of time to a scrub who literally gets undermined by a bunch of little kids. One thing I love about this game is that it was not at all scared of shying away from the typical Zelda formula. This is one of the few games where there is no Ganon, no Master Sword, and no Princess Zelda, aside from one very brief cutscene. It just shapes an even more uncomfortable playthrough knowing none of these familiar tropes return. So after you find all the Bomber Kids, Link is granted access to the Astral Observatory, which is incredibly surreal and beautiful, but also highlights one of Majora's Mask's most prominent themes, that being an underlying feeling of sadness mixed with hope. The song played here just perfectly captures this game's theme, and that's one of the main reasons I love the Astral Observatory so much. After looking into the telescope, you're given the chance to take one of the moon's tears, which is required for progression. You actually have to bring this to a Deku Scrub placed right in the center of town, so Deku Link is granted access to the flower which launches him up to the stairs leading to Skull Kid. You then have to shoot a bubble at him to cause the ocarina to fall out of his hands, which is when Link can pick it up, and once you learn the Song of Time from a memory of Princess Zelda, after playing it with the Deku instrument, the game resets completely, essentially starting anew. Now's the time to go back to the Happy Mask Salesman and learn the Song of Healing, so that way Link can turn back to his Hylian form. You also get to keep the Deku Mask, which allows Link to transform back into the Deku Scrub at a moment's notice. This is when the game truly starts, and right out of the gate, there's a wealth of optional tasks that can be completed before even tackling the main story. This is another way Majora's Mask separates itself from its predecessor. Rather than focusing heavily on dungeons and locations like before, the side quests are now where most of the action is discovered. I'd say if you don't plan on doing any side activity in the game, there really is no point in playing it. So much will be missed out on if only going for the main quests. Learning about Termina's character and each of their quirks is part of what makes the game so special. The side quests carry the game, and without them, Majora's Mask would absolutely not be remembered as fondly as it still is today. And that's not to say the main game is bad by any means, because they're just objectively wrong. Sure, I have my issues with the game, which I'll go over in time, but for now let's just focus on gameplay and structure of the world. Right out of the gate, Termina Field is a great improvement over Hyrule Field. While Hyrule Field was revolutionary for its time, at times it would feel extremely barren and exhausting to traverse. That is not the case with Termina's counterpart, however, as each main area of the game is sectioned into 4 different sections of the map, essentially forming one big circle with Clocktown sitting right in the middle, sort of emulating a hub for the players to enter and exit in order to reach these different places. The first place Link explores is the Southern Swamp and Woodfall, which houses the game's first dungeon. Here you'll meet the witches from Ocarina of Time, except this time they aren't evil like many players probably expected the first time they played this game. No, in fact they are quite friendly this time around, even offering Link a free boat ride and giving him a bottle, which is obviously one of the most valuable items in the pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda games. Anyways, each region of Termina covers one mask, which essentially replaces the items seen in Ocarina of Time. The Southern Swamp heavily focuses on the Deku Mask, which means most of the traversal and puzzle require this mask for progression. Once you arrive in the Deku Palace, the king describes how he's gonna boil this monkey to death for no reason other than false accusation. So it's Link's job to navigate the place in order to find this monkey and learn the song from him, which is obviously going to be very important. His song is called the Sonata of Awakening, which is one of my personal favorites in the game. Koji Kondo once again outdid himself with the soundtrack, as it's just another reason Majora's Mask shot into stardom. The soundtrack absolutely completes the experience and complements each area and dungeon perfectly. This game really wouldn't be the same without Koji Kondo's brilliant understanding of video game music and atmosphere as a whole, as many players even consider the soundtrack to be better than Ocarina of Time's. But back to the game itself, tackling the first dungeon of the game is next task handed out to Link. This is a Woodfall Temple, and when comparing this temple to Ocarina of Time's first dungeon, the Great Deku Tree, the spike in difficulty is made abundantly clear. Now this may come down to the fact that Majora's Mask only has 4 dungeons, as compared to 7 previously, but not only that, I think the developers really expected the players to understand the mechanics of the game this time around, because rather than teaching them to play through a dungeon, we are already expected to know how these work because of Ocarina of Time. Now something that was a little disappointing to me was the items given out in these dungeons. In Woodfall Temple, after fighting the mini-boss, you get the bow, which is fine, but every single dungeon after this just gives you a new type of arrow to use with the bow, such as fire, ice, and light arrows. Though it may be a little bland compared to what we got previously, the masks act as this game's main source of items, so I really can't complain. The boss of Woodfall Temple is Odalwa, and this is one of the most controversial changes within the original Majora's Mask and its 3D remake. In the original, bosses could be defeated by wailing on them with whatever items you had available at the time until they were defeated. However, this time every boss has this eyewall weak point that I personally hate. It dumbs these battles down so much because you know that the only way to beat any of them is by exposing their eyes, then slashing the eye with your sword or shooting them with your arrow. For example, Odalwa used to be an exciting sword fight, but now all you do is use Deku Link to fly over him and drop a Deku Nut on his head, which then exposes the weak point. It just really isn't fun, and I have no idea why Nintendo changed this. But after beating the boss, Link is taken to this very surreal area, which makes heavy use of motion blur to make it feel even more dreamlike. This is where we discover that these giants are the guardians of Termina, and to free them, each temple needs to be completed. Finishing a dungeon usually shows a quick cinematic of that current area being restored to its former, glorious self. However, this always feels completely pointless, as the second Link plays the Song of Time, everything will be undone, and everyone will be suffering again. This further drives home the feeling of dread, which is clearly this game's main theme, and I love it all the more for it. So now it's time to go after Snowhead, which is a huge step up in difficulty from Woodfall. Everything is so obscure here, there really is no hand holding at all in this game. Here you get the Lens of Truth, which is mainly used to follow Darmani, who was once a proud Goron warrior before he was killed by another Goron placed under Majora's curse. Following this guy all the way up to his grave and playing the Song of Healing for him rewards Link with the Goron's mask, which is definitely the best mask in the game, especially in the remake. Wearing this mask fools everyone into thinking Link is the dead Goron warrior, and that he suddenly returned out of nowhere to help them, when in reality, it's just Link. This is actually pretty depressing when you think about it. I mean, imagine if in real life, some animal or something was wearing the mask of a dead human, which makes him appear as that deceased person, fooling them all into thinking it's actually a human. Yeah, it's both horrifying and sad at the same time. But that's besides the point. Wearing the Goron mask can fool this old man into thinking you're Darmani, and after hearing that his son is in need of him, he teaches Link the first half of the lullaby, which is used to put the baby to sleep, as well as open up the entry to the next dungeon. This baby teaches you the other half of the Goron's lullaby, which finally means you have all the tools required for the next dungeon, Snowhead Temple. This place is terrifying. It contains a huge central room with rising pillars which must be knocked down at very specific times, otherwise the whole thing gets messed up. In my opinion, this is the most difficult dungeon in the game, as it definitely took me the longest. However, one thing I really liked about the temples in Majora's Mask is how smart they require the player to be in order to complete them. You can't just run around and expect to finish these. Each one is intricately designed with a central room and main gimmick that designed to be mastered, otherwise there's literally no hope in finishing any of these. The mini-boss in Snowhead is Wizrobe, which really started to get on my nerves by the end of the game. He's definitely a prime example of how rushed Majora's Mask was, considering you fight him numerous times with very minute changes. And on top of that, it's just not a fun fight. All you do is wait for him to teleport around, then shoot an arrow. And in Snowhead Temple, you're rewarded with the fire arrows for defeating him, which just opens up the area even more. There really is an overwhelming amount of things to do here, including collecting all the stray fairies, which grant you amazing abilities. So while it may be hard to find all these, it's well worth the payoff, and it offers a great risk-reward system to the player throughout each new temple. The boss fight here is probably the best one, mainly because you don't really need to focus on the eyeball weak spot that much. Sure, the eye still needs to be destroyed, but racing around as a Goron trying to keep up with this thing is extremely exhilarating, and it feels great to actually defeat it. Overall, a great dungeon with a top-notch boss fight to cap it all off. Now it's around this point in the game where you can finally upgrade from the dinky Kokiri sword to the Razor sword, but sadly, this weapon completely breaks in 100 hits, so even though it looks amazing, you gotta upgrade it again with gold dust to get the Gilded sword, which sort of functions as this game's Master Sword. It's more powerful and it never breaks, also doing double the damage as the Kokiri sword. So now that you've unlocked the ability to become a Goron, you can reset time and go buy a powder keg, which allows access to Romani Ranch on the first day, you know, before Romani gets lobotomized. Tons of events occur here. For starters, Link finally reunites with Epona, so now you have the option to call on her whenever you need. Unfortunately, her use is very diminished in this game due to the Goron's mask existence. Whenever Link transforms into a Goron, he can travel way faster than with Epona. It's also less of a hassle to use Goron Mask because you won't have to play the ocarina. After this, Romani describes these ghosts appearing as aliens known simply as them. This is incredibly intriguing and lends even more mystery to this game. Once you complete some target practice on these balloons, Romani will tell you how at 2 AM the aliens will come and she needs his help fending them off. This is by far the most random and weird side quest in the game, as you're literally defending a farm from ghost aliens, but it's still a lot of fun and can be pretty tense due to the main directions these aliens spawn in from. But if you're able to fight them off for long enough time, the ranch will be saved and Romani will reward you with a bottle. This opens up another side quest where you take a stroll into town with your older sister Cremia, but there's construction so you need to take a detour, which means keeping two of these from breaking the milk on the back of the wagon. This has a surprisingly heartwarming ending, as Cremia gives Link a mask and acknowledges him as an adult. These side quests are what help make Majora's Mask such a special and unique experience. But since that's finished, you can actually make your way over to the third area of the game with Epona, Great Bay. This is where you get the Zora mask after listening to this one sing and drop dead right in front of you. Now in the Nintendo 64 version of the game, this mask was incredibly fun to use. However, in the remake, they made it to where you can't boost without using magic, which just completely ruins the controls and fun that the original game set in place. This usually just ends up in swimming being extremely slow in order to preserve magic, and it just makes everything absurdly boring and frustrating. As mentioned earlier, the masks fulfill the role of the most important item now. The Zora mask even fills up two of these items, those being the Iron Boots and the Zora Tunic. Once the Zora mask is obtained, you gotta get the eggs from the Pirate's Fortress, which can be very difficult unless you cheat your way through it by giving this guy some medicine in exchange for a mask that literally turns Link invisible and makes this whole section a complete cakewalk. This is where you find the hookshot, one of the few major items returning from Ocarina of Time. In the Pirate's Fortress, the main objective is to collect 4 of the 7 Zora eggs that lie within fish tanks in certain rooms. And again, this is super easy with the stone mask, so there really isn't much to talk about here. Now you can go after the 3 other eggs which are located in Pinnacle Rock. But first you need to give this creep a picture of the Gerudo Pirates. For some reason. Anyways, this seahorse directs you to Pinnacle Rock, where you must destroy these eels to find the remaining 3 Zora eggs. This finally completes that filler section and gives Link the important dungeon song. This one's pretty cool. I like how all the little fish start dancing around all cute. You can now open up the entrance to Great Bay Temple with this song, and this is a dungeon which most people consider to be the hardest, and I definitely agree that this can be pretty tough, but Snowhead will always give me the most trouble. Great Bay Temple's main gimmick is this giant water wheel which must be manipulated by activating different water switches. This can be quite tough, especially if you aren't careful and you forget which rooms you've been in. This temple also holds a very annoying mini-boss, where you just have to wait and shoot his giant blob thing with an ice arrow. Yeah, one thing this game doesn't do right is the mini-bosses, that's for sure. Most of them are either repeated or just not interesting in their execution. The boss of this dungeon is absolutely terrible, I'm just gonna say it, but I really don't think I'm alone when I say that. Many people seem to hate this boss as well. It's just beyond frustrating, especially in the 3DS version. Oh my lord, this thing sucks. I can't even begin to explain how frustrating this encounter is. It lasts way too long and has 0 redeeming qualities. End of story. Well, after that painful experience, it's time to enter the last area of the game, Icona Valley. And this whole section lasts a very long time. You first need to learn the Song of Storms so you can play it to this one ghost in order to force the Gibdos into hiding. But then you have to enter this strange music box house, only to find a half mummified man, and when his daughter sees you trying to kill him, it's actually quite heartbreaking. This is definitely one of the most emotional parts of the game, and it really just goes to show how hopeless everyone in Termina really is. The part after this is one of my biggest problems with the game, however, and that is the abundant amount of filler. Obviously, this game was so rushed. There was bound to be some unnecessary content present, but this just pushes it too far. You have to go on a major fetch quest in order to give each of these Gibdos something very specific, which just ends up being an awful waste of time. They literally could have done anything else but this and it would have been better than what we were left with. This single part right here is literally what makes me not want to replay this game whenever I consider booting up a new save file. Yes, it's really just that bad. At the end of all this, you finally get the Mirror Shield and have to take on another mini dungeon, that being Icona Castle. This one really isn't that great or interesting, besides having absolutely incredible music. It also pulls a fast and dirty one on anyone who's never played this game before. You see, right at the end, there's this giant crack in the floor which needs to be blown up with a powder keg, which can only be bought from a specific Goron in Clocktown. So they really expected someone who's never played this game before to actually have a powder keg on them once they reach this point. It's just another example of filler. But anyways, there's a little fight here which can be pretty annoying at times, but basically, you just fight the king's 2 henchmen, and once defeating them, you fight the king himself, which really isn't all too difficult. You just melt him using your mirror shield. But after that, he decides to teach Link the most horrifying song ever. And no, I do not mean the melody itself, it's actually quite nice. But look at what the song creates. This abomination scared the soul out of me the first time I saw it. There's just something about it that really freaks me out and gives me an unpleasant feeling. I used to just get out of this room as fast as I can because I thought it would kill me if I messed around with it for too long. Thankfully, that's not true. So after that, you finally get to make your way up to Stone Tower Temple, which can also just be brutal for new players. You need to play the Elegy of Emptiness in very specific orders to move these blocks, but if you fail, you have to restart the whole process. Also, the sheer amount of times needed to play the Elegy of Emptiness is exhausting. I mean, before even reaching the actual dungeon, you'll be burned out with this song and being forced to watch these statues move 100 times. The Stone Tower Temple is often considered to be one of the very best dungeons in the entire series, and I totally agree. It's extremely fun and has tons of branching pathways to take. It's also very daunting and requires lots of attention to complete. It makes use of all 3 transformation masks and really lives up to the expectations of what a final challenge should be. But that's not all. Halfway through the dungeon, you need to shoot a light arrow at this gem in order to literally flip it on its head. So now you have to play through the entire thing upside down. It truly is great and a genius way to expand upon the dungeon, especially for the time it was released. This place is just huge and feels so good to scale and complete. Sadly, I can't say the same for the boss. Yep, this fight against Twin Mold, and it's yet another victim of the remake's terrible change in boss fights. Originally, you fought this thing with a sword, so it really felt epic. It felt like you could just go to town on these things until they were dead. But now you don't have access to your sword, and you don't even get the Giant's Mask until halfway through the fight. And once you get the mask, you have to spend so much time just waiting for the red guy to fly out, all while you frantically push him numerous times just hoping you'll take it down. And once you finally do, you get to do this pretty cool wrestling move against it, but it stops being cool after the 90th time you get to hit this stupid thing. Anyways, now that that's completed, it's on to the final part of the game, which takes place inside the moon. It was very unexpected to suddenly go from chaos into this serene and surreal, sunny environment. This is just one of the many genius ways Majora's Mask plays with your expectations and emotions. Here you'll find these kids running around, which eerily resemble the Happy Mask salesman, at least from their hair, which just brings even more questions to what he is and what his motives actually are. If you interact with one of these moon children, they'll ask you to give them some of your masks, which will bring Link to a sort of mini dungeon. These can be pretty confusing, and if you complete all of them, you're rewarded with the Fierce Deity mask, which can literally kill Majora in a few seconds, so I'm going to talk about the fight proper. To initiate this battle, you need to talk with this creepy kid wearing Majora's Mask for some reason. This fight is way tougher than most other final encounters in the Zelda franchise, mainly due to how chaotic it is. You've got to deal with all the previous main bosses shooting lasers at you, along with Majora itself. In this one phase where he just runs around screaming frantically was so entertaining, and when it started moonwalking, I just lost myself. This whole fight was so hilarious, but difficult at the same time. This game is just so marvelously weird. Well, that's Majora's Mask. I don't think any game will ever quite achieve what this game did. It proved the impossible, that even though a horribly strict time limit was placed upon them, with a talented enough team, something truly special can be created. If you're going to play The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, I recommend going for all side quests and obtaining all the masks because it really just doesn't feel like you're experiencing the whole game when you don't. But if there's one thing you shouldn't do, it's playing this as your first Zelda game. Trust me, it will overwhelm you and could completely turn you off from the game. That would be doing a disservice to not only the game, but yourself. Play Ocarina of Time, then Majora's Mask. You'll be pleasantly surprised with the amount of cohesion these two games share among each other. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to meeting you guys in the next one. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker was quite the divisive package when it first released. As everyone knows by now, this was due to the choice by Nintendo to make this game cel-shaded and very cartoon-like. Rather than receiving something on par with Ocarina of Time's art style and graphics, we were given something completely unique and different, which 20 years later is showered with endless praise. People went from absolutely hating to adoring this game along with all its quirks. And I think one of the biggest reasons for this is the Zelda games that would release after the Wind Waker. With each new game introducing us to a new iteration of Link, along with a brand new art direction, people grew to appreciate and love the Wind Waker for what it is. As it stands, this is now one of the most beloved games of all time, and it's no surprise to see why. This was my first ever Zelda game, so naturally, I hold a soft spot in my heart for this entry, but that doesn't mean I won't still address all the game's flaws and misfortunes. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The Wind Waker opens up with Link's sister Aryll searching all over for him, only to stumble across him sleeping on a watchtower for some reason. So as early as the introduction, we are introduced to this lovable little moron, and he's so out of it that he literally forgets it's his birthday when he wakes up. Link, what were you doing last night? Well, this is when Aryll tells you to go visit your grandma, and right away things are much different than they ever have been before. Characters here are much less serious than they ever were in any previous installment, like this guy is just trying to catch a pig for some reason. Meanwhile, if you give this lady a pig, she will reward you with rupees and also stuff that creature full of food. Before speaking to Grandma, make sure you steal her secret stash underneath her house, and then go talk to her, yeah. She gives you the iconic green outfit that every hero had worn up to that point. Link doesn't seem too pleased with it though, he actually seems quite repulsed by the outfit. He reminds me of a kid whose grandma knitted him a sweater for his birthday or whatever, but he hates it because he wanted toys or something. Yeah, that's how Link acts. It's hilarious. So now that you gotta go back up to the watchtower and meet up with Aryll, and she gives you the telescope, and once you zoom in, you'll find this giant bird known as the Helmarok King, literally getting boulders launched at it by these pirates. This bird is carrying Tetra, who is the leader of the pirate crew. Once Link witnesses this, he can go talk to Orca, and Orca is one weird dude. He teaches you the basics of sword combat, and just straight up lets Link keep the sword afterwards. So cool, now you gotta make your way all the way to the top of Outset Island, where you need to fight up these enemies in order to save Tetra. Now Tetra is a very refreshing character for the Zelda series. She's kinda like the Sheik of this game, except much sassier and enjoyable to be around. At first, she shows zero compassion towards Link, and isn't even grateful that he rescued her. Tetra is just a cool character overall and very unique for the Zelda franchise. Now once saving her, you go outside to see Aryll waiting for you, only to get kidnapped by the giant bird, and what does Link do? He runs off the cliff. Yup, he just decides to end it all right here, guys. Luckily, Tetra saves Link from being an idiot, and demands that he gets a shield if he wants to travel with them. So you go back to Grandma's house, and she gives you the shield, but she's being super whiny about the whole thing. Like, you know Link is just thinking, Grandma, please shut up and let me save my sister, you old raisin. Anyways, now that you've got a shield, you can finally begin the game proper. And I love how when Link is waving goodbye to this island and everyone on it, Tetra basically just tells him to stop being a giant wuss. Now this is when you have to play a minigame with this guy Nico down here. He's kinda weird and definitely the outcast of the crew. The challenge is really easy on the HD version because of the enhanced rope controls, but on the GameCube this could turn into an agonizing mess. I played both the GameCube and Wii U version of this game multiple times and still think the HD version is the definitive way to play. As much as I love the original release, it just doesn't compare to all the quality of life changes the remake brings to the table, but that's just my opinion. So anyways, after completing this little mini game, Nico gives Link the spoils bag, and now you've got to sneak into the Forsaken Fortress. This sequence right here never fails to make me laugh. It sounds like Link starts beatboxing once Tetra puts him into the barrel catapult. I love it. This poor guy gets launched straight into a wall, and you gotta wonder how the guy doesn't have brain damage by now. I mean, considering all the times he gets absolutely plastered against a solid structure. So Link loses his sword and has to traverse the Forsaken Fortress to recover it. This is my single least favorite part in the game, as it just feels completely unnecessary. It's a stealth mission executed very poorly. Having to sneak around the moblins is fine enough, but finding your way up to the searchlights in order to disable them can just turn into a complete and total drag. This place could either take you 10 minutes or an hour, it really just depends. Once you retrieve Link's sword, you fight this incredibly easy mini-boss, then get kidnapped by the bird. He takes you to Ganondorf, who just tells the bird to throw Link into the ocean. This is where you meet the King of Red Lions, who functions as Link's partner for the game. In a way, he's the best partner in the series simply due to the fact that he hardly disrupts the gameplay at all, and he really lets the player figure out most things out on their own. Minna is still the best as far as the story goes, but I'll get to her one day. The King of Red Lions makes you scour through Windfall Island in order to find a sale for him, but before doing that, why don't you just pay your good old pal Tingle a visit, who's in jail for some reason. Buddy? What did you do? Well, in any case, we're just gonna free him and let this mad lad run free. He gives Link a map to his island, then takes off. Look at his bed! Tingle bro, how is that comfortable? You're literally sleeping on a plank of wood. Well, this is where you can now navigate through this little maze until you reach the Picto Box, which only serves to take pictures, leading to a side quest later on. After that, you can buy the sail from this one guy and finally depart for the Great Sea. This is where the adventure truly begins. The Great Sea is a very divisive overworld. Many people either hate it or love it. I fall in the category that loves it, however, I still see its flaws. There are 49 sections to the Great Sea, all which can be kept track of using the sea chart, which you fill out by giving bait to this fish in each section. Now, while the Great Sea is a very big place, traversal is one thing that can be very tedious at times. For me personally, I always found it incredibly peaceful and relaxing to sail around, especially at nighttime, and the HD version only improved things further. In the GameCube version, sailing could be extremely tedious thanks to having to play the Wind's Requiem constantly in order to change the wind direction and get to your destination. In the remaster, the Quick Sail was added, which you can win from the auction house on Windfall Island. This is one of the most useful quality of life changes I've ever seen, as it not only increases your sailing speed by double, but it also completely removes the need to play the Wind's Requiem a million times, as the wind direction automatically changes with any direction you're facing while using this sail. And the best part about all this is that it is completely optional, which is why I don't understand when people complain about the new changes. If you don't want the Swift Sail, you don't need to buy it. This game really is in the player's control and can be experienced in any way you want to. But as for the Great Sea's content, well, it definitely varies in quality. There are a few standout locations which offer multiple things to do, but most of the map just consists of a single little island with nothing more than a little small minigame to play, or Great Fairy to find. Now I understand that the Wind Waker was a very rushed and unfinished game, as they literally had to cut out 2 entire dungeons, but that doesn't stop the Great Sea from becoming a pretty barren overworld. But personally, my joy doesn't all come from the islands themselves, but rather just how relaxing it is to sail the seas and run into new discoveries. Even if it just results in a minigame or something minuscule, I still find it very enjoyable to make my way over to whatever section of the map I feel like exploring, and in my opinion, this game along with Breath of the Wild are the 2 hardest Zelda games to put down. They both captivate the player in so many ways and offer endless tasks for you to take on. In the Wind Waker, I find one of the most peaceful areas in the game to be these underground grottos. I love the mysterious vibe these locations give off, and the music is so fantastic and fitting down here. The extensive use of the pan flute really enhances these areas and makes them feel even more surreal. More times than not, I would just stop for a few minutes and take a breather down here. These are just so perfect to relax and reflect on your journey. And now that I've covered the Great Sea, I'm going to cover the dungeons. In all honesty, these aren't the greatest in the series. For starters, there are 7 in the game, but that's including Forsaken Fortress and Ganon's Tower. None of these areas are bad per se, but they are incredibly average with the possible exception of the Earth and Wind Temple. Dragon Roost Island is the first major area of the game, and this is where the Rito reside. Here you meet Medli, who serves a much greater function later down the line. As for now, she gives you a bottle for throwing her up onto the sledge, which is then used to introduce bombs to the player through forcing you to blow up a rock with one. This leads you to the first dungeon in the game, Dragon Roost Cavern. I really love the atmosphere here, and it looks absolutely gorgeous with all the fire and lava, though it is incredibly easy as to be expected since this is the first dungeon. It's a pretty great first dungeon though, and one thing I particularly like is how you spend all this time inside this fiery cave, only to exit and be immediately thrown into sunlight. The contrast here is amazing and is one of the best examples of why the Wind Waker's art style is so timeless and unique. Rather than being jarring, this just feels refreshing. You get the grappling hook here, which is a complete mess in the original release, but here in the HD version it's actually very fun to use. You can now switch directions mid-swing rather than having to come to a complete stop and turn. The animation for using it is also much quicker and more efficient, so it's much less of a slog to get through the rest of the dungeon. You use the grappling hook to fight Goma, who is obviously the source of all the problems Dragon Roost Island is facing. This is a pretty standard battle and not very difficult at all. You just use the grappling hook to swing around until Goma loses its shell, then slash at its eyeball with the sword. Defeating it causes Prince Komali to give Link the first pearl because you now gotta get the 3 items in order to cause the main event to happen. Now you can learn the Wind's Requiem, which as stated earlier, can be made almost completely irrelevant once you obtain the Swift Sail. The second dungeon takes place in the Forbidden Woods, but first you gotta make your way up the Deku Tree in order to receive the Deku Leaf, which is like a prototype of Breath of the Wild's glider. This is a really fun tool and its limited use fits this game's world very well. Using this leaf you gotta go save Makar, this stupid little Korok who fell into the Forbidden Woods. This dungeon is my least favorite in the game. It's not terrible, I just get very tired of the environment very quickly. The enemies here serve as a massive nuisance rather than a legit challenge. But hey, at least you get the boomerang here, which is much more fluid here than it was in Ocarina of Time. You can now lock onto 5 targets at a time, and it's super satisfying to just watch it slash through everything. Kalidimos is an even easier fight than Goma was, as you literally just use the boomerang to knock it down, and in my case, I literally killed it in a single round. After this, the Great Deku Tree gives Link this pearl, which means you only need one more, so you gotta go to Great Fish Isle, only to be told that you gotta sneak onto the pirate ship on Windfall Island, who are currently tying this guy up for selling bombs for too many rupees. This is great because it shows just how these pirates will do anything in order to get what they want. They really do bring great personality to this game that we don't really see anywhere else in the series. Now you gotta sneak onto the ship and play a slightly harder version of the same minigame you played earlier with Nico. He'll give you the bombs, finally. Once finishing the game, but of course Tetra sees you and challenges you to get to Outside Island before they do. So now you get to your home island and blow up these stone slabs, only to realize that there is, in fact, no dungeon here. But you get the pearl from Jaboon anyways. This was no doubt one of the dungeons that Nintendo had to cut in order to meet deadlines, as I'm sure Great Fish Isle would have housed a temple there. In any case, now that you have the 3 pearls, you can finally open up the way to the next dungeon, and I love how Link just goes flying here once placing the last pearl in the statue. This never fails to make me smile a bit every time I play through it, even though I know what's gonna happen. I mean, that scream is just hilarious. But this opens up the Tower of the Gods, which is a pretty solid temple that actually requires a little bit of thinking. You still never end up with more than 1 key, as is the case with every dungeon in the game actually. But you get the bow here, which feels great to use, especially with the new gyro controls. This place mainly focuses on guiding these statues back to their original pedestals, and you do this by using the command melody, which again, works much better this time because in the remake, songs don't repeat back to you once you play them unless it's your first time logging back into the game. So this definitely turns into one of the most unique dungeons due to its gimmick, but the boss fight is pretty fun and climactic. Sure, it's just a face and hands boss from every Zelda game, but this one just feels more important to fight, because defeating it actually opens up the way to the underwater Hyrule Castle. This place is awesome, and I love how all these enemies are frozen until Link pulls out the Master Sword. Speaking of which, now you get the Master Sword, and once claiming it as your own, you get to fight all the unfrozen monsters, which is super exhilarating, and it feels great being able to slaughter all of them with the newfound power of the Master Sword. The part that follows is also pretty great. Link needs to revisit the Forsaken Fortress in order to save his sister, and now you can just kill the moblins rather than being thrown right in jail, and cutting your way through enemies all the way up to the top is much more enjoyable than sneaking around them. Once you find Errol, the pirates take her with them, and you finally get to fight the Helmorok King. First you gotta escape up to the top, but the second phase just sort of requires you to wait around for the dumb bird to land, but whacking it in the beak with the skull hammer you got by defeating Phantom Ganon earlier is the greatest feeling ever. You really feel like you're getting to take all your anger out on this bird creep, and watching it blow up in the air makes you feel extremely accomplished and really shows how Link has grown as a hero. This is where Link comes face to face with Ganon for the first time, and this is definitely one of the best incarnations of Ganondorf we've ever seen. He's actually very sympathetic, as all he wanted to do was save his people. And he has real motives for wanting the Triforce rather than just ruling over the world. He wants to restore Hyrule to its former glory. It's a really cool story and he makes for a surprisingly deep character. This is something you wouldn't really expect from the Wind Waker just by looking at its cartoonish and playful art style, but make no mistake, this is definitely one of the most deep and depressing Zelda games as far as the story itself goes. So basically after meeting Ganondorf, it's revealed that the Master Sword isn't powerful enough to take him down yet, so you gotta visit 2 more temples to restore it. This is where one of the most underrated Link moments come in. I find it hilarious how he's just standing there all confidently with Tetra, acting like he's got everything under control with his little sassy stance, until, boom, he's immediately jump scared. This is one of my favorite parts in the Wind Waker. It's small but it always makes me laugh out loud. So now it's revealed that Tetra is, in fact, Princess Zelda. Who would have guessed? Nobody who played Ocarina of Time was about to fall for that again. The king just drops exposition and reveals that he was actually the king of Red Lions, that we've been sailing around with all this time. And I love how he just starts teleporting around in a static position. It looks so goofy. Pretty stupid of them to just leave Zelda down here though. I mean, we all know what's going to happen to her. So now you've got to find a giant water cyclone and shoot the frog god controlling it with your bow. This gives you the Ballad of Gales, which acts as the fast travel for this game. Now you can finally drop into Mother and Child Isle and get the fire and ice arrows from this creepy fairy girl thing. Aw, she even has a crush on Link. How cute. And I love how the King of Red Lions just looks behind him like, yeah, you hearing this, dog? So now you gotta do a few random things. The first is heading over to the Ice and Fire Islands to grab the power bracelets and iron boots. These locations were both very likely supposed to function as dungeons, and it's a shame that they didn't because they probably would have been very neat, at least in atmosphere. You use the power bracelets and iron boots to learn songs which are played to the sages. But the way this whole thing is executed is just ridiculous, it's absurd. The King of Red Lion marks both Headstone and Gale Isle on your map at the same time, implying, you know, that you're able to take on whichever dungeon you want first. But you can't. You actually have to learn the Earth God's lyric for Medley, because the Wind Sage, Makar, just drops off the face of the planet for some reason until you beat the Earth Temple. So you gotta go back to Dragon Roost Island and find Medley, in order to play the song for her which reveals her to be a sage. Meaning, you need to take her with you to the Earth Temple. This dungeon is super cool, it's incredibly linear, and I find constantly having to use Medley with the command melody to get pretty old fast. But other than that, it's got great atmosphere and nothing managed to shock me more in the entire series more than running into a Redead here for the first time. These things are unnecessarily horrifying this time around. I can just imagine a little kid playing this and just screaming once they find one of these things. You get the mirror shield here, which looks amazing and much less creepy than that awful face from Majora's Mask. The mirror shield is used mainly to solve light puzzles by combining the shield with Medley's harp in order to cast light onto a statue for progression. This last room in particular puts this practice to great use, and is a perfect final test of the player's knowledge on the light reflecting mechanics of the dungeon. The boss fight here is fun, but super goofy, and if you learn the Hurricane Spin from Orca earlier, then this encounter is completely a cakewalk. Completing this returns half of the power back to the Master Sword, and the wings finally pop out, giving it that classic look we all know and love. Now you gotta find Makar, who's for some reason hiding inside a waterfall at the Forest Haven. Once playing the song for him, he's revealed as a sage and you can make your way to the Wind Temple. Can I just say, it's very weird how Medley, a literal bird, is the Earth Sage, while Makar, a literal tree creature, is the Wind Sage? What? Gotta love the continuity in this one. The Wind Temple is by far the most complicated dungeon in the game, and the closest to resembling something from Ocarina of Time. It's a good dungeon, but got very tedious very fast because of Makar. Having to use a command melody on him and fly him all the way up to the top of these platforms gets very old, very fast. You get the hook shot here, which is cool because it requires other items to be used in tandem with it in certain cases. For example, here you have to use the iron boots with the hook shot in order to make these statues fall. I also like how you need to use it with Makar's tree in order to progress. This place definitely is very labyrinth-like, and you can certainly get lost without paying attention. The boss here is alright, it's got great music, but it mainly just comes down to trying to hookshot the main enemy, rather than all the little mini creatures. After doing this, Master Sword is finally restored to its full potential, which means you can now take on Ganondorf. Okay, never mind. This starts a very controversial Triforce hunting quest, which I'm gonna be honest, I used to hate, but now love. You see, finding all these shards in the original release requires paying Tingle 3,184 rupees in total. So if you don't have an expanded wallet, well then you're completely screwed. This hunt also got incredibly tedious with the sailing after a while, but the HD version completely fixes this. Now you only need to pay Tingle to decipher 3 of the 8 Triforce maps, as 5 of them were removed and just replaced with the shards themselves, making this much more manageable. I also love how all the quests you're forced to go on in order to find these shards. This is the part of the game where I believe you should really start exploring every island to your heart's content, because now that the hook shot has been obtained, every island is made available and you're free to do whatever you want. This section also highlights the main point of the Wind Waker, which is to take your time and explore. There is no rush here, no timer, and nothing to worry about. Just you and the endless ocean. One thing that bothers me, however, is the ghost ship. This place is awesome and would have been so cool if it was made into a full-fledged dungeon. You hear a bunch of mysterious things about it from the fishmen, but it literally is nothing more than an enemy gauntlet which kicks you out upon obtaining the Triforce. After collecting all 8 shards, you can finally go underwater and make your way to Ganon's tower. I love how the outside of Hyrule Castle looks down here. Ideally, it would have been nice to have some areas to explore down here since it's literally Hyrule Field, but considering the lack of development time, what we got is more than acceptable. Ganon's tower itself is super underwhelming though, especially considering Ocarina of Time's final dungeon. You literally just fight 4 rehashed bosses from earlier in the game, but after this Link actually needs to traverse this maze with a clever puzzle. Once defeating Phantom Ganon, you need to watch the hilt of his sword and follow the direction it's facing. However, doing this multiple times gets old since the puzzle never changes. After killing enough of these phantoms, Link finally gets the light arrows, which are absurdly amazing in this game. They literally obliterate any enemy that's not a boss in a single shot. This leads us to the fight with Puppet Ganon, which houses 3 different phases. This is a pretty tough fight actually, and it makes great use of the player's spatial surroundings. The last phase in particular can be difficult because this puppet goes flying around and you can't lock onto it, so it's all about great timing here. Once beating this, you have to fight Ganondorf himself, but before that is this great little section where the player has to climb all the way up to the top of the tower. This is super tense and the atmosphere in this room is unmatched. You really feel like you're about to face the endgame. The fight with Ganondorf is nothing short of stellar. After the King of Hyrule wishes for Hyrule to be flooded, the entire place starts to fill up with water during the fight. This is by far the greatest atmosphere for a final boss in the entire Zelda franchise, with the possible exception of Tears of the Kingdom, since that one is brilliant too. Defeating Ganondorf is unusually violent, as Link literally parries off of him into the air and cuts directly into his skull. This is just another example of the Wind Waker being much more brutal than it seems. The ending is also quite tragic as the king along with the entirety of Hyrule is flooded, leaving only you and Zelda as survivors. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker really is a beautiful game, and though it has its flaws, as time has progressed and we have seen more entries in the Zelda franchise, this game has only aged better and better. It's easy to take things for granted such as The Wind Waker was, and sometimes it takes time to realize that what you've been gifted with is truly special. It's a shame that we will probably never get another home console Zelda game with this incarnation of Link, and this world, because it is genuinely one of the most charming video games to ever exist, and it will continue to age like fine wine through the decades to come. The next Zelda game we'll be looking at is a highly contrasting Twilight Princess, so join me then. Thanks for watching. Let me ask you a question. Out of all the Zelda games, which one would happen to be your favorite? Well, you see, that's just the thing. If this question were to be asked to multiple people, you would almost certainly end up with a different response from each individual. The Legend of Zelda is a franchise unlike any other. Its level of innovation is nearly unmatched in the gaming industry, as every title truly thrives to be its completely own, unique experience. Ultimately, that fact right there is one of the biggest reasons people tend to dislike Twilight Princess. After the reception that The Wind Waker received for its cartoonish art style, Nintendo really had no choice at that point if they wanted to save the Zelda franchise. So in order to please the fans, they constructed something that is such a 180 spin in the other direction from The Wind Waker, as the art style, characters, and theming are marketed towards an entirely different demographic from before. All of this culminated in an experience oddly reminiscent of Ocarina of Time, meaning the fans got exactly what they desired at the time. Well, how does Twilight Princess hold up after all these years? Let's find out. So this game opens up way differently than all of its predecessors. Rather than waking up from a nap, like Link usually does, he's talking to Russell, the swordsman of the village. Link is immediately established as a hard worker, and he seems much more mature than any of the previous iterations of the character. As everyone knows, Twilight Princess receives a ton of flack for its absurdly long opening and introduction, and with great reason. I can understand this drawn out tutorial, for those who have never touched a Zelda game before, but for someone who's played this game multiple times, the thought of having to replay this part can completely steer away returning players. Personally, whenever I think about starting up a new save file, I dread the fact that I will have to sit through an hour of unnecessary cutscenes and pointless tutorials on how to herd goats, fish, use a slingshot, and use a sword. Each Zelda game has its own gimmick, and this time around it's Wolf Link. This is the definition of a great idea gone terribly wrong. This new edition comes with a slew of issues, most notably with the Tears of Light. In each region of the map you were required to collect numerous Tears of Light by hunting bugs, of all things. This would have been cool if used maybe once, but overall, this concept gets old extremely fast, and the worst part is you're stuck in this form until you collect every tier. And only after clearing the region from Twilight are you returned to Link's Hylian form. Perhaps the biggest missed opportunity here was the combat used for Wolf Link. Since he turns into a literal beast, you'd think there'd be more options at bay for you to pull off, but there's not. You literally just get a spin move and a basic bite attack. It would have been nice if there was a finishing blow for Link's wolf form rather than just his human form. For example, after knocking an enemy down, you could have jumped on top of them and ripped them to pieces, and oddly enough, you can actually do this with the pose, so it just serves to make the whole situation more confusing. However, Link in his regular state actually has a greater variety of attacks than ever before. These come in the form of Howling Stones, which you first need to find with Wolf Link, then howl in order to cause the hero shade to appear in different locations of the map. This is a really cool idea, as each move grants you tons of unique ways to take on enemies and serves to make the combat much more enjoyable. I especially like the last move taught to Link, the Great Spin Attack. This allows you to inflict double the damage upon any enemy as long as you have full hearts. It feels incredibly awesome to completely annihilate enemies with this move, and the other skills you learn are great as well. My other complaint with this is that, unfortunately, these moves are optional, which means the enemies don't possess any proper form of defense, leading to very easy encounters throughout the game. If these were made mandatory, more room for interesting battles could have been opened up, thus giving more incentive to find these secret skills. And as for the enemies themselves, none of them are too interesting, as this is one area where the game's art style really suffers. I actually like the more realistic look given to Twilight Princess, but unlike the Wind Waker, it doesn't hold up that great. Some of the enemies here that were in the previous game, such as the Bokoblins, look absolutely terrible compared to how they used to. None of the characters or enemies really have any emotion, and even when they are trying to be expressive, the art style just doesn't allow it. However, one area where the art style really shines is the Twilight Realm. As mentioned earlier, this is where you go bug hunting with Wolf Link, but besides that, the atmosphere here is unlike anything ever seen before or after this game, with the possible exception of the depths from Tears of the Kingdom, which seem to take heavy inspiration from the Twilight Realm. For starters, the music used here fits the mood perfectly. It feels so digital and just doesn't sound right when listened by a human ear. The developers pulled off something quite impressive here, as it truly feels like you're in a totally different universe once teleported to the Twilight Realm. The enemies down here are also a parallel of most enemies from the Light World, which creates an even more unsettling atmosphere. To this day, I have never felt more uncomfortable in any area of a Zelda game than I feel every time I enter the Twilight Realm. It really is an unforgettable experience. Twilight Princess contains 9 dungeons, which is a big step up from the Wind Waker, not only in quantity, but also in quality. These all feel like bigger versions of Ocarina of Time's template, with a few brand new ones thrown into the mix. None of these are bad in the slightest, and after coming off of Majora's Mask, which only had 4 dungeons, along with the Wind Waker, which contains some of the weakest in the series, it's a massive breath of fresh air, getting to experience something similar to Ocarina of Time again. See, one of the biggest complaints towards Twilight Princess is how it is basically just Ocarina of Time 2.0 or whatever, but last time I checked, that is literally the highest rated video game of all time. So is it really such a bad thing that Twilight Princess adopts many of that game's attributes? There are also lots of new items hidden within these dungeons, which are tons of fun to use. The Dominion Rod translates statues to life, and getting to just destroy everything in your path with this is probably the most satisfying feeling in the entire game. My favorite item by far is the double claw shot, which you obtain from the city in the sky. This is such a simple yet brilliant addition that enhances the environment tenfold. In my opinion, the best part of all these dungeons is how unique they are. None of these even remotely resemble each other, and as far as atmosphere goes, these are probably the best in the entire series. The Palace of Twilight is so ethereal and unsettling, and there's a few parts in there where a giant Zant hand chases you, and it is seriously one of the most anxiety-inducing feelings you will ever find in a Nintendo game. Snow Peak Ruins is a dungeon that takes place inside an old, worn-down mansion that a Yeti couple inhabit. In turn, this is one of the most memorable dungeons in the franchise for many due to its unparalleled environment. However, this level of quality seen in the dungeons is not carried on throughout the entire game. Hyrule Field is fun to explore at first, but there are plenty of things to do here that usually come down to digging into a hole, collecting a random heart piece, or grabbing a golden bug. Speaking of which, these golden bugs are one of the main collectibles in Twilight Princess, and their whole purpose is to satisfy this character named Agatha, who is creepily obsessed with bugs. The main issue here is that every time you give her any bug, she in turn gives Link rupees. The problem later comes down the line when you realize that your wallet isn't big enough to fit all these rupees in. So what does Agatha do? She gives you the upgraded wallet size after obtaining all the bugs in the game, which is completely pointless by that part of the game. I just don't understand it. But one thing I'm very glad returns is the grottos. These are such a minor thing, but if you've seen my Wind Waker video, then you know how much I adore the grottos simply because they produce some of the most atmospheric locations I've ever seen in a video game. Each Zelda title puts a spin on the grotto theme, and Twilight Princess's iteration of it is just as perfect as the Wind Waker's. But anyways, one thing that is universally praised about Twilight Princess is Link's companion, Midna. To this day, she is still considered to be the very best companion that the Zelda franchise has ever seen, and this is completely warranted. She has her own goals, and the only reason she even tags along with Link in the first place is because she wants to use him to restore peace to the Twilight Realm. Midna shows zero compassion towards Link's situation as a wolf, or to the Light World. She even taunts Link by pretending to be his friends. This selfish attitude is why the ending pays off so well. Throughout the entirety of the game, you're helping Midna search for things. First it's the Fused Shadow, then the Mirror of Twilight, but progressively you start to see your character change and become more sympathetic of Link. In the end, she wants to help both the Light and Twilight worlds, and this mainly stems from her hatred of Zant, who is the self-proclaimed ruler of the Twilight Realm. The great part about all this is that we get to see just why she loathes Zant so much. He nearly kills her halfway through the game, but not only that, he's the one responsible for transforming her into the imp form we see for the majority of the adventure. Many have said that this game feels more like Midna's journey rather than Link's, and I couldn't agree more. It really does feel like Link is just tagging along for the whole thing, and not really gaining much from it. Which is honestly totally fine. Every other Zelda game is about Link's journey to save Hyrule, and while that concept is still very much present here, it's nice having Midna as a change of pace from the usual formula. But though this may not seem like Link's adventure, that doesn't stop Twilight Princess from being one of the most epic Zelda experiences of all time. And I truly mean epic. This game is absolutely enormous, and if there's one thing it pulls off better than any of its predecessors or successors, it's making you feel like a true hero. The soundtrack is bombastic and triumphant, and everyone looks up to Link and wants to be just like him. All the kids back in his hometown adore him and want to learn everything he knows how to do. Even right at the beginning, they beg Link to let them use his wooden sword. And I know it's just an excuse for the tutorial, but it's actually really heartwarming seeing them all admire Link's skill with the slingshot and sword. This adds a great sense of community and passion to the game, so while Midna may be dragging you all around Hyrule to collect her trinkets, at least you're rescuing the people of your village in the process. Adding to this, another thing I love is Link's character design. Why am I talking about this? Well, because for one thing, I find it very weird how just about every character in the game looks, well, yeah, not the greatest. The attempt to make the art style realistic just dated the game hard. The environments look amazing, but some of the character models here look straight out of a PS2 game. This brings me back to Link. His model actually looks incredible along with Princess Zelda, and these two iterations of the beloved characters are actually some of the favorites among fans. I just find it weird how in a world of ugly character models, we get Link and Zelda who look nothing short of amazing this time around. You'd think with the HD version they would have updated or at least slightly tampered with some of the models, but that's not what happened at all. In fact, Twilight Princess HD probably is the least enhanced out of all the Zelda remakes. There was definitely a lot of work put into the textures here, and if you really pay attention to how these textures used to look, you can see how much of an improvement there was. Unfortunately, there really isn't that much of changes added to the base game. There are a few welcome fixes, such as the Tears of Light requirement being reduced and the climbing speed being increased, thank God, but in a way, some may look at the lack of changes as a blessing, because if they had tried something crazy, it could have ended up worse than the original. For example, with the remakes of Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and The Wind Waker, lots of people have pointed out that the enhanced lighting system actually destroys the game's original atmosphere. While I don't agree with this, I can definitely see where they're coming from. However, I feel like if any game really needed a graphical overhaul, it was Twilight Princess. But in the end, the HD version still looks great, and I'm just grateful we got it. Now Nintendo, please just port these remakes to the Switch. Good lord, it's been long enough. Aside from that, I'm going to talk about my absolute biggest issue with Twilight Princess, that being the sudden reveal that Ganondorf was behind everything. Like seriously, do we need Ganondorf in every Zelda game? He looks awesome this time around, but that doesn't change the fact that he just shouldn't have been included at all. The whole thing just comes across as jarring because the whole time we are led to believe that Zant is the main enemy here, and the ultimate goal is to defeat him. It seems like the only reason Ganon is even here is because the Zelda team was panicking about the fact that everyone wanted the Zelda game exactly like Ocarina of Time, which obviously had Ganondorf in it. In the end, Zant should have just been the only villain, as not only would this have distinguished Twilight Princess from the rest, but it would have given much more room to flesh out Zant's character rather than just revealing that he was a weak-minded individual used as a pawn in Ganon's plan the whole time. However, one thing I actually like is the final encounter with Zant. I think it's actually very understandable when he completely loses his mind and goes crazy in the end. His lust for power has become so strong that he literally can't even control himself anymore. That's why I don't agree with people when they say that this part ruined his character. I personally think that what ruined his character the most was the introduction of Ganondorf, honestly, as I stated earlier. If I had to choose between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, well, to be honest, I really wouldn't know. Since this game is so frequently compared to Ocarina of Time, I think it's only fair to compare the two and see what things each one did better. In terms of overworld, I think we can all agree that Twilight Princess succeeded much more. However, it doesn't really seem fair to critique Ocarina of Time for this due to the fact that it was the very first 3D Zelda game. So obviously the hardware wasn't as advanced as something like the GameCube, which is what Twilight Princess originally released on. But what about dungeons? Well, in this case, I have to give the edge to Twilight Princess, but only because I find the puzzle solutions to be more creative. That being said, Ocarina of Time had absolutely genius temples and I adored every single one. So as you can see, we aren't really getting anywhere here. And that's because when it comes down to it, these games are both very unique from one another. Sure, they may share a lot of the same core concepts and themes, but at the end of the day, playing Twilight Princess is a vastly different experience from Ocarina of Time. And they are both incredible in their own distinctive ways. So in the end, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess really does stand on the shoulder of giants, and it would be unfair to put this game down for not living up to its hype because, in my opinion, it most certainly did. This is such a massive adventure full to the brim with emotion, engaging mechanics, and bold new ideas. Midna is most likely as close to perfect as we're ever going to get from a companion, and that ending cutscene with her actually manages to be very emotional and well set up throughout the entire game. You really do feel like a hero, who was once just a simple farm boy. Getting to experience Midna's change of heart and desires, along with Link's rise, is nothing short of fascinating, and these stories are why I adore the Zelda franchise so much. As much as I love Twilight Princess, I'm glad it never got a direct sequel like The Wind Waker, because unlike that game, I feel like everything here was able to be experienced in one beautiful package. And on top of that, the story ends on a perfect note, leaving Link and Midna to protect their respective worlds. Next up on the list is the very controversial Skyward Sword, so I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching. Skyward Sword is one of the strangest Zelda games to play through. Originally released in 2011 for the Nintendo Wii, this would act as the origin story for the entire Zelda franchise, taking place at the very start of the timeline. Right off the bat, it is made abundantly clear how story-focused Skyward Sword is. This game starts with a very long cutscene highlighting Link's nightmare as well as showing off Skyloft along with the Loft Wings. Much like Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword receives tons of backlash for its absurdly long intro. However, in my opinion, this time things are much worse. In Twilight Princess, at least you could skip cutscenes and the introduction didn't drag on as long. And even though these errors were rectified in the HD version of Skyward Sword, that doesn't change the fact that this game just takes way too long to introduce the characters and mechanics. However, one major highlight of Skyward Sword is Zelda herself. This time around, there is a clear line of romance set between her and Link, which drives incentive to rescue her because rather than being a mandatory burden, the player knows how much Link loves Zelda, so in turn, the story immediately becomes more interesting. Now, as everyone knows by now, Skyward Sword's main gimmick is the inclusion of motion controls. At the time, this seemed like an absolutely perfect fit for the Wii Remote, however the execution is severely underwhelming. Link can only swing his sword in one of 8 directions, which can make enemy encounters more painful than they need to be. Simple enemies like Dekubabas and Bokoblins are much more of a chore to face off against, because if the sword decides not to cut in the proper direction, you'll end up whiffing all your attacks and eventually just waiting for the enemy to lower their guard, which completely ruins the whole point of having motion controls for the sword. However, when the sword does work, it is extremely satisfying to cut down enemies, especially when you land multiple attacks in a row. One nitpick I have is that unlike in Twilight Princess, you can't run and swing the sword at the same time anymore. This seems like an odd downgrade because I imagine being able to perform this with motion controls would have added a lot of depth to the combat. The motion controls in general within Skyward Sword just confuse me as some items such as the whip, work, and gust bellows work perfectly fine with this playstyle, and feel very natural to use, but on the other side of the spectrum we have items like the bug net and bow, which don't feel great to use, and I can think of a few different ways to fix these problems. For me, the bow could have worked more like Twilight Princess, where you could use a stick to survey the camera, rather than the far inferior method of having to move the bow all the way to the side of the screen in order to move the camera. This also could have applied to other items, but I guess what we're left with is more than manageable. It's just a shame Nintendo didn't capitalize on the potential of the motion controls. But with that out of the way, I think it's finally time to dig into the game proper. Traversal in Skyward Sword is another thing that fell completely flat. In concept, using the Loftwing bird to navigate a massive sky could have resulted in a highlight for the overworlds of the Zelda games. However, there are a few misfortunes which completely drag this down into oblivion. For starters, you'd think, with a sky as big as this one, there would be plenty of islands and minigames to discover, but this couldn't be further from the truth. What we're left with is a barren wasteland which makes the Wind Waker's Great Sea seem completely packed with content in comparison. There are very few islands which actually contain something worthwhile, but most of the time flying all the way over to one of these only results in finding a goddess cube, which more times than not only yields rupees. The few locations that actually have content are pretty interesting, such as Fun Fun Island and the Lumpy Pumpkin, but overall, the sky is just a shameless excuse for an overworld and actually makes me appreciate the previous games even more. On top of that, the bird controls are terrible with motion controls. However, you can use button controls in the Switch version, so at least that slightly redeems it, but the bird itself is just way too slow to be enjoyable, and it takes ages to reach any of the locations or regions in the game. Speaking of which, Skyward Sword houses 3 different regions, all which function more like dungeons rather than actual areas to explore. Farron Woods is the first region you visit, and the entire objective is just tracking down all the Kikwis, which is very monotonous and uninteresting. Having to use the dowsing technique to locate these things becomes very tedious, very fast. All of this results in the Elder giving Link the slingshot, which is the first major item in the game, because of course it is. But I actually think it's executed better here than in most other Zelda games. Using it to knock down these vines is a unique action for the slingshot that's never been done before as far as I'm concerned. I also love knocking bokoblins off their tightropes into the endless abyss. It's so much fun. By using this slingshot, we make it all the way to the first dungeon, Skyview Temple. If there's one thing Skyward Sword got right, it would definitely be the dungeons. They actually all offer something completely unique to one another and introduce a mechanic used once, then never again upon completing the temple. For example, in the Skyview Temple there's this very genius puzzle that no doubt made thousands of players, including myself, feel stupid when realizing in order to defeat these eyeballs, all you need to do is move the controller in a circular motion in order to make them dizzy and open up the pathway for progression. Puzzles like this distinguish Skyward Sword from the other Zelda games in a very positive way, and make for some truly memorable moments. In the Earth Temple, Link rides around on this giant ball, and you need to use a map in a clever way to notice that there are small cracks in the walls which can be exploded with bombs. This dungeon is a great twist on the typical Fire Temple seen previously, and I particularly love how the lava looks with this unique, painter-like art style. Anyways, the main item acquired in the Skyview Temple is the beetle, and due to it not having much to offer in terms of combat, the boss fight here utilizes one-on-one sword melee. But before you can access the boss, you need to break your wrist in order to insert the boss key into the final door. And I honestly hate doing this because it's literally required in every dungeon throughout the game. The boss here is Girahim, and in my opinion, this is one of the greatest villains in the entire Zelda franchise. He's absolutely nuts, and every time he's on screen I become completely invested in what he has to say and what weird actions he performs. Fighting him is also very fun because it actually uses the sword in a great way. Since he also fights in a very basic manner, landing swings on him with the sword is enjoyable, and his guard doesn't constantly switch around like the Bokoblins. Defeating Girahim unlocks the path to Zelda, which just ends up being a massive tease for Link. This is executed well here, but considering the numerous amounts of times this happens, it gets old and predictable very quick. This is when Fi pops out and performs a song for us, which brings me to the single worst part about Skyward Sword. Fi acts as Link's companion, and she's by far the worst companion in the Zelda series. She was created by the goddess Hylia in order to guide the chosen hero to victory, but all it does is make me want to drive the chosen hero off a damn cliff to save him from her constant harassment. I know the HD version fixes a lot of her interruptions, but it's still a bit much, and some things she says are completely irrelevant and pose no meaning to the player. Fi adds nothing valuable to the gameplay, as well as the story, and the whole thing could have been played without her and there'd be next to no difference. But after completing the Skyview Temple, the next destination is Eldin Volcano. As I mentioned earlier, I like the first dungeon for this area, the Earth Temple, but I really don't like the traversal which leads to the temple. I actually like how the bombs work in this game, and it's amusing how you can roll these as opposed to just throwing them. But climbing all the way to the top becomes very tedious, mainly due to there only being one very strict way to the top. There's literally not an ounce of room for exploration here, which causes the whole thing to become a massive drag. The third and final region is Lanayru Desert, which still requires linear puzzle solving in order to uncover the dungeon, but it's probably the best region in the game due to how open it is. It's not great, but it's definitely the closest to exploration this game ever offers. The problem with these three regions isn't the theming themselves, but rather the fact that they are visited a total of 3 times each. This adds up to a frightening amount of filler, which creates a very one-and-done experience. I have played Skyward Sword the least amount of times out of any Zelda game, and one of the biggest reasons for this is because of the repeated overworld usage. The first time visiting each of these regions is fine enough, because they are fresh and new, but after this the whole game just sort of falls apart slowly over its remaining course. Now I will admit I love the Silent Realms used in each location, and this is for many reasons. The Silent Realms are basically just the bug hunting from Twilight Princess done right. The atmosphere in these sections is nothing short of brilliant, and create by far one of the most intense and stressful situations in the entire series. The main goal is to collect all the tears scattered throughout the environment without getting caught by the Guardians, and these Guardians are just plain terrifying. Their design is genius because rather than looking evil, they actually look like the goddess herself created them as more of a test rather than an actual threat, because if they hit you, all that happens is the trial restarts. They don't actually kill Link. And another thing I love about the Silent Realms is that they actually make good use out of the rehashed regions. Since you have no items or sword, you're forced to come up with different solutions as to how you can obtain all the sacred tears, and this becomes a very enjoyable experience and a respectable challenge. Completing a Silent Realm rewards Link with a gift from the goddess, which acts as the way to progress to the next dungeons within the different regions. This is where things really start to become monotonous, and while I think using the new items to unlock different areas of the regions is interesting in theory, it's just not executed well here at all. The progression usually ends up being absurdly tedious, such as the swimming in Faron Woods, or the water collecting in Eldin Volcano. The only area which succeeded in this aspect was the Lanayru Desert. Using the time shift stones to travel through a once sprawling sea is incredibly interesting, and one of the most intuitive concepts ever seen in a Zelda game. The time shift stones are carried on throughout this entire section, and even used in the next dungeon, the Sand Ship. Rather than being multiple timeshift stones like there were in the main mining facility, there's only a single stone placed directly in the middle of the ship, which brings the ship either forward or backward in time. This dungeon is extremely brilliant and one of the few examples of the game actually testing the player's mind and making them thoroughly think through a problem. The rest of the dungeons are great too. The second temple in the Pharaon province is the Ancient Cistern, which is one of the most beloved dungeons of all time. You also get the whip here, which is probably the most enjoyable item in the entire game. The motion controls fit this item like a glove and using it feels like secondhand nature. The dungeon itself starts out very serene and peaceful with surreal music, but around halfway through, you bury the statue underground and visit this hellish counterpart of the serene area traversed in the beginning. This place is super inventive and the decision to turn all the bokoblins into zombies was a particularly nice touch. The best part about all of this is the ending where you have to desperately climb your way out of the underground on this tiny thread while zombie bokoblins chase after Link and try to grab him. This place is very satisfying to unravel and is a genuinely perfect challenge. There's also the Fire Sanctuary, which is a bit of a step down from the Ancient Cistern and the Sand Ship. It's still an okay dungeon, and the magma mitts offer a nice change of pace for the player. Crawling around underground gets boring after a bit, but it's still a cool concept which makes for interesting puzzles within a dungeon. Now the bosses in Skyward Sword certainly vary in quality. Scaldera is defeated much like King Dodongo from Ocarina of Time, and it's clear that that's where the inspiration for this boss was. Moldarok is a pretty underwhelming battle, as trying to deal with its claws can be frustrating, especially with the motion controls not working well. The Imprisoned is one of, if not the worst boss fights out of the whole series. The main issue here stems from the fact that you have to fight this thing 3 different times throughout the game, which is the definition of lazy filler. This fight could have been vastly improved if Nintendo just decided to make it one long and exhilarating battle, but they split the stupid thing into 3 separate encounters which grow more exhausting with each second that passes by. They attempt to make things more interesting by using Groos's machine to launch bombs at it, but this does little to redeem the Imprisoned of its absolutely abysmal mechanics. On the brighter side of things, Galactos is considered to be one of the greatest boss battles in the franchise, and with great reason. Using motion control to rip this thing apart with its own limbs is nothing short of fascinating. You really do feel like you're tearing it to shreds, and it's one of the best ways motion controls has ever been implemented in any game. There's also Tantalus, which is a massive disappointment. The starting section where you have to avoid its tentacles and all the barrels it's throwing down is great, and it creates a ton of mystery as to what this creature actually looks like. Then you get outside and actually see it. What an embarrassment. This thing is basically just Celia from Monsters Inc., but it's even less threatening than her. He's just a big fat lumpy version of her, and all you do is shoot him in the eye with your bow, then slice it up. There's also this incredibly forgettable fight with the parasite on Levias' back. It's not bad, just extremely basic. Then there's the other fights with Girahim, which are obviously enjoyable because he's insane, and over time he gets stronger and more difficult. I especially love the final encounter with him, and each phase utilizes the motion controls in a great way. Demise is the final fight in the game, but I'll touch on that later. For now, I want to mention Skyward Sword's soundtrack. This was the first Zelda game which was fully orchestrated, and while I think parts of it sound beautiful, I'm honestly not the biggest fan of it. I think it fits cutscenes and boss fights very well, but the overworld theme while flying around doesn't sound nearly as good as something like the Great Sea from the Wind Waker, which was definitely not orchestrated. This style just makes certain parts of the game sound a bit underwhelming, and leaves the soundtrack less memorable than the other Zelda games. But that's just my opinion. If you love the soundtrack, I totally understand and respect that. It's just not my personal favorite in the series. On top of that, it seems like the best songs were used in very short sections of the game, such as Fi's introduction and Farewell. Perhaps one of the best aspects of Skyward Sword is the characters and side quests. Now, I'm not a big fan of most objectives for the side quests, as it usually just ends up in fetching something and bringing it to someone. What makes these great is how the characters react. Each and every one of them has a very distinct personality, and it reminds me a lot of how Breath of the Wild would turn out. Completing a task for someone rewards Link with gratitude crystals, which can be exchanged with this demon for useful upgrades and heart pieces. And speaking of Breath of the Wild, Skyward Sword may be vastly different from that game as far as the design goes, but if you really look, it's not too hard to see that Skyward Sword created much of the things that Breath of the Wild would end up perfecting years later. For example, the stamina meter appears for the first time in this game, which is a much better option than rolling around all the time. Eventually, Breath of the Wild would improve on this by dropping the roll mechanic entirely and also offering upgrades to the stamina meter. There's also the upgrade system, which isn't great, but definitely acts as a great predecessor to Breath of the Wild's system. So after you complete the 3 areas for a second time, you gotta go back to each one of them for the 3rd time, as I mentioned earlier. Now this right here is when Skyward Sword throws out all chances of replayability in a tragically humiliating way. This entire part could have been cut out completely and the game likely would have been much better because of it. So basically you need to travel to each region in order to learn parts of the hero's song from the 3 dragons. I'm specifically talking about the water dragons portion, which is a literal nightmare. Collecting tad tones is no way fun, inventive, or interesting in the slightest. What we have here is a complete waste of time, and it's just blatant example of padding. It also makes no sense at all considering how many times Link has already proven himself worthy of the song to this dragon. The Eldin section is at least more interesting than the water part, with the stealth section requiring you to reclaim all of Link's lost items located throughout the area. This is a very cool concept, but it's executed poorly. The whole thing just drags on and takes way too long to play itself out, but at least the Fire Dragon just gives Link the song and doesn't require him to complete some arbitrary tasks like before. The Lanayru part is very forgettable as you basically just transport the Timeshift Stone all the way to the Thunder Dragon, who's actually dying, so you need to save him by growing a tree containing a fruit that can heal any sickness. After giving this fruit to Lanayru, he teaches you the final song of the hero, and that unlocks this optional boss rush section where if you defeat enough enemies in a row, Link gets the Hylian Shield, which is completely indestructible. I actually really like this part because since it's optional, it's able to be as difficult as developers want. And this is one of the few real challenges in Skyward Sword with great payoff as well because earning an indestructible shield is very useful for the endgame. Speaking of which, now that you've collected all parts of the song from the dragons, you can now head back to the Levias and learn the full song of the hero, which actually sounds great. This opens up the final Silent Realm, which takes place on Skyloft. This is pretty unexpected the first time around, and this is by far the most terrifying Silent Realm. The Guardians and Tears are in tough places now, but completing this unlocks the final goddess gift, which is the other eye of this bird statue. Once you return the eye back to the bird, the final dungeon is opened up. This is the Sky Keep, which I'm honestly not the biggest fan of. Don't get me wrong, this is a great dungeon, with some truly devious puzzles, but I really hate these sliding block puzzles, as I just feel like they are way too complicated, and they don't have enough time to introduce the player to the central mechanic before things get super difficult. Or maybe I'm just dumb. I don't know. You collect the Triforce here, which I find kinda crazy. Like in all the past Zelda games, even containing one part of the Triforce is a huge deal. But this Link just casually collects the entire Triforce and wishes to kill Demise with it. This sets up a sort of false ending where Demise is presumably dead and Zelda is perfectly safe and sound. This obviously isn't the case though, as Girahim breaks in and steals Zelda out of thin air. He starts creepily dancing around and trying to start the ritual to revive Demise. He then throws a bunch of enemies at Link and places barriers up. I have an issue with this last part, however, as I feel like this is one part of the game which would have been vastly improved by the simple option to run and slash your sword. Imagine if you could just run and cut your way through every single one of these enemies in one fell swoop. It would have been much more satisfying and made Link appear more angry and desperate, which would have immensely improved the experience. Anyways, once reaching the bottom, it is revealed that Girahim was actually successful in completing the ritual, which fully revives Demise. One thing I really like is how Girahim is revealed to be the evil counterpart of Fi. His spirit gets sucked into Demise's sword, creating a twisted evil version of the Master Sword. I thought this was very well done and gives a great ending to Girahim's character. Demise is a pretty well written villain, as he actually respects Link for standing up to him and not cowering away, even going as far as to create an environment for them to fight in which is completely free of distractions. The fight against Demise is pretty fun and makes great use of the motion controls. The first phase isn't too interesting, but once you knock him down and start phase 2, things completely change. I love the atmosphere in this room, and the harsh blue lighting completes the look and creates a stunning final few minutes. This fight is actually pretty hard if you don't know what you're doing. I love using the Skyward Strike to ignite the sword in lightning and hurling a beam at Demise. And flying into the air, plunging right into him is extremely satisfying. He then places a curse on Link and Zelda, which basically just describes why Ganondorf exists and is pretty meaningless in the grand scheme of things. After this, the game attempts to be emotional by sealing Fi away in the Master Sword forever. But it's not effective at all, considering that she spent the entire time annoying the everlasting life out of the player. If they wanted this to craft any impactful feelings, they shouldn't have even made her a spiritual robot in the first place. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword is one of those games you just don't play multiple times unless you wait years between each playthrough. While it may have its merits, there are just far too many things weighing it down from reaching the level of other Zelda games. You gotta have respect for Skyward Sword in some way, however, as it did help Nintendo realize what not to do for the future installments in the franchise. Skyward Sword walked so Breath of the Wild could run, and that's just a simple fact. In the next video, I'll be looking at the most influential Zelda game and possibly the greatest game of all time, Breath of the Wild, so I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for your support. In my personal opinion, Breath of the Wild still remains as the greatest Zelda game ever made, even after the release of Tears of the Kingdom. In fact, the sequel only pushed my love for Breath of the Wild to new heights. There are many reasons as to why I believe this game still outshines its predecessors and its successor, all of which I will go over in this video. So without further ado, this is my retrospective of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The intro sees Link awakening at the Shrine of Resurrection after 100 years of slumber due to the critical amount of damage his body received after fighting in the war against Ganon all those years back. The tutorial here is very brief, with Zelda basically just explaining how the Sheikah Slate works. There's also a really crappy pair of clothes Link can put on before exiting the shrine. This whole opening was done in a spectacular way, as there is a rock you need to get over before the title sequence plays out, which discreetly introduces the player to climbing. After exiting the Shrine of Resurrection, you're thrust upon the Great Plateau, which to this day still remains as one of, if not the single greatest tutorials in any video game up to this point. There are numerous things that will catch the player's eye from the second they are given control of Link. The Temple of Time stands out as the main attraction, so most will probably attempt to head over there first, but even as early as this, there are little distractions peeling you away from the previous objective. For example, on the path to the Temple of Time, you can talk to the old man, who yells at you for taking his apple. You can jump into this ring to unlock a Korok seed, you can fight enemies, and so much more. The best part about the Great Plateau is that it doesn't feel like a tutorial in the slightest. All the player knows is that they can't leave the plateau without the paraglider, but within a few minutes, you're likely to even forget what the main goal is, simply due to the abundance of different things to tackle on this island. The introduction of climate changes is also displayed to the player here, as Link needs to cross through the freezing cold environment with some form of protection, otherwise, he will die. So it's up to you, as the player, to discover a way to accomplish this. The game makes no attempt to hold your hand or outright tell you how to solve this, and that right there is the entire point of Breath of the Wild. There is no set solution for any puzzle, as you can go about any of them in any way you please. In order to enter cold environments, the ideal solution is to cook up spicy peppers, which creates a dish that is resistant to the cold weather. But you can also eat while sprinting through the area without using cold protection. And this just makes for an experience which every player will no doubt remember for years to come. You can even find the warm doublet here if you take the time to scale up this little area, which completely negates the need for cold resistant food for the rest of the time you spend on the Great Plateau. Once spending enough time here, Zelda will direct Link to the first tower in the game, which acts as a war point for Link, but not only that, it also fills the map out in whichever region the tower is located in. Including one of the towers on the starting area was genius because it shows how useful they can be, thus accentuating the excitement in players wherever they see a glowing orange tower in the distance. Shrines are also introduced here, and the way this is executed is nothing short of brilliant. The old man tells Link that if he completes one shrine, he will give him the paraglider. So this just adds even more anticipation. But what he doesn't mention at first is how there are actually 4 shrines on the Great Plateau that must be completed in order to gain access to the paraglider. These 4 shrines act basically like tutorials for different runes used within the Sheikah Slate. These runes are incredibly useful throughout the entire game, so it's nice that they were fleshed out here, rather than just being handed to Link. Stasis allows you to freeze most objects, and if you hit them with a certain amount of times, the object will go flying whenever the timer runs out. This is not only useful for puzzles, but also opens the way to some incredibly fun and inventive glitches which are still relevant to this day. Magnesis turns every metal object into a playing ground for Link, and allows him to move any metal item wherever he wants. You can do some pretty cool stuff with this, and if used correctly, you can even take down frustrating enemies. Cryonis allows you to place up to 3 ice blocks on any form of water, which can be incredibly useful early on in the game when you don't have much stamina and need to traverse long bodies of water. Lastly, the bombs come in 2 different variants, those being rounded and square bombs. This solution is so much better than forcing the player to find bombs along the way, much like every other Zelda game. They don't do much damage, but giving the player an unlimited supply of these ensure that they will be able to access any challenge right from the get-go and never have to worry about running out. So once you finish all 4 shrines here, the old man finally meets up with Link and tells him to meet at the Temple of Time. The reward for clearing a shrine is a Spirit Orb, which can either grant Link an extra heart container or an increased stamina gauge. That right there is a sheer definition of freedom. Allowing the player to choose what they want to do with their reward makes room for so many different playstyles and lends an incredible amount of replayability to this game. They even went as far as to give you an option to swap heart containers for stamina vessels, and vice versa if you find yourself needing more of one over the other. Speaking of freedom, once meeting up with the old man, he drops exposition and explains that he's actually the former king of Hyrule who died along with all the champions during the Great Calamity 100 years ago. None of that really matters to us though, considering we just got ourselves a paraglider, meaning the adventure can truly begin. This part of Breath of the Wild completely overwhelmed me on my first playthrough, years ago, in the best way possible. The king directs Link towards Kakariko Village, and that is by no means required, as you can literally go the entire game without even visiting Kakariko. In fact, it's almost impossible to not immediately get distracted and head off in a completely different direction because you see a shrine, tower, enemy encampment, or something else you want to tackle. One thing I actually really like about the story here is that it is almost exclusively portrayed to the player through the eyes of different characters throughout the world. Random NPCs explain how they feel about the Great Calamity, or something else related to Ganon or the Divine Beasts. There's also the memories which can be searched for, and play a brief cutscene of an event that took place all those years back. I do find most of these memories to be a bit underwhelming, but in concept I love the idea of having to travel to different locations in order to trigger Links to remember something crucial from before he was wiped out. And besides, with the world this big, I'm sure the story wasn't the main priority this time around, as crafting an immersive environment for the player to get lost in was no doubt in the forefront of every developer's mind.
Gee, this is uplifting.
And I don't think it's a surprise to say that they absolutely came through and delivered something that may never be topped or recreated by any other game studio for decades to come. Where to even begin? Hyrule this time around is so massive that there really is no definitive starting point when talking about it. The enemy variety, while not huge, definitely works well with the environments they were placed in. But the best part about the enemies is that they aren't just mindless drones walking around. They all have distinct personalities. For example, one moment you'll encounter a Lynel, the toughest enemy in the game, which are extremely smart and very versatile, containing a large arsenal of deadly equipment. But on the other end, you can spy on a bokoblin hunting down a boar by twirling a spear above its head while riding a horse. The Hinox are these big clownish enemies, and their battle theme captures that perfectly. There are a few more enemies, such as the Lizalfos, which are lightning fast and dodge most of your attacks if you don't pay close attention to them, and the Moblins, who are these giant pig-like creatures that pack a hefty blow. Every character and enemy in Breath of the Wild is stuffed full of personality and charming quirks, and it only serves to flesh the world out further. This brilliant design is carried on throughout the game's many shrines as well. These aren't always a case of just finding and walking into them, and while there are plenty that only require just that, tons of them can be accessed through some elaborate quest. Some of these side quests can be extremely engaging, and I find it very enjoyable to complete a challenge only to be rewarded with a shrine for my efforts. The greatest example of this is within Eventide Island. Upon landing here, all of Link's equipment and clothes are taken from him, and as the player you were required to collect 3 orbs and bring them to their pedestals in order to unlock the shrine. What makes it so enjoyable is the feeling of being vulnerable again. Having to scavenge your way through this place and sneakily hunt down the enemies replicates a feeling that is only present in the early stages of the game, where you have no powerful materials or equipment. On top of that, one of the orbs is guarded by a Hinox, so you can either choose to carefully nab the orb from its chest, or just fight it like I'm sure most of us did. Accomplishing all of that opens up a shrine, which is one of the most satisfying experiences of the game. Now I won't lie, there are a few duds in there. There's a test of strength shrines, which are repeated a bit too much if I'm being honest, and the challenge is always the same, with each one being a minor, modest, or major test of strength and only requiring Link to take down a single guardian before being rewarded with the spirit orb. These are disappointing because you have great shrines like the aforementioned Eventide Island, but then you have shrines like this where all you need to do is take down one enemy to get the same reward you get for fighting a Hinox in nothing but your underwear. But perhaps the most notorious shrines are the ones requiring motion controls to complete, which even I have to admit are just plain awful. It's like Nintendo just had to throw a bit of Nintendo in there, you know? They just had to force motion controls on the player in some parts of the game, because that's just how Nintendo rolls. But these are few and far between and will never take away the enjoyment I get from the rest of the shrines. And with the amount of freedom given to the player in this game, almost every shrine can be completely cheesed if you know the right method, which is always a blast to pull off. One thing that got an unnecessary amount of backlash from the community was the soundtrack used for this game. After all these years, I still don't understand how anyone could dislike the soundtrack here. The piano takes a forefront in Breath of the Wild, and I don't think it could have been executed any better than it was here. The subtle piano notes played throughout the day and night express a certain loneliness and really show how Hyrule really has fallen and shattered to ruins. The main villages and Divine Beasts get their own unique soundtracks though, and all of these sound spectacular. Rito Village in particular is so good that I find it hard to even leave this place once the melody kicks in. It's so beautiful, and I think the musical direction used in this game was one of the smartest decisions Nintendo ever made with Breath of the Wild. One thing that people don't seem to think was smart was the durability system. Forcing every sword, shield, and bow to break after enough usage was heavily criticized by the fanbase, and personally, I don't mind it at all. I mean, think about it. If every weapon had unlimited durability, what would even be the point of collecting new items? One of the most enjoyable aspects to Breath of the Wild is going out and searching for new powerful materials that can strengthen Link's arsenal and take down enemies much quicker. All of that joy and curiosity would have been stricken from the game if even a single weapon was made unbreakable, but that's just my opinion. The only item in the game that I believe should have been unbreakable, or at least a bit stronger, is the Master Sword. This is literally the sword that seals the darkness, so it makes no sense that it has to recharge after a certain amount of usage. At that point in the game, I feel as though the player has accomplished enough to wield the sword permanently. However, I do like how the sword glows and doubles in damage whenever Link is surrounded by malice, guardians, or in a dungeon. And it's particularly a neat touch how it shoots out beams whenever you're at full health. Speaking of dungeons, the Divine Beasts take that role, and I gotta be honest, looking out into the distance and seeing one of those things moving around had me intrigued from the very start. On my first playthrough, I remember being completely blown away when I realized that these would function as the game's dungeon. In theory, this is one of the coolest ideas I've ever seen in a video game, but in execution, it sort of falls flat. Now let me explain why. For starters, I don't think the actual dungeons themselves are bad. I really like how you can solve any puzzle in any order you want so long as you have the skill to do so. The soundtrack in these are all immaculate, as I stated earlier, but my biggest problem here simply comes down to theming. Each of the 4 Divine Beasts look exactly the same on the inside. Every wall, ceiling, and floor, and contraption shares the exact same ancient-looking theme that we've already seen in all the shrines up to this point. I think if these were given more diverse atmospheres, then they wouldn't get as much hate as they currently do today. And they also would have been far more enjoyable to traverse through. The other big issue with these is the boss fights residing in each one. Every Divine Beast has some form of Ganon that you fight after finding all the terminals, and these are known as the Blights. Thunder Blight, Water Blight, Fire Blight, and Wind Blight all look incredibly similar and all play out in pretty much the exact same way with the exception of Thunder Blight Ganon. This fight can be very tough if you don't have the Master Sword, because it moves at blinding speeds, and its usage of lightning means that you can also lose your weapons if you're not careful. As for the rest of the Blights, you can really just hack away at them until they are defeated, and Fire Blight Ganon tries to distinguish itself by using a fire shield for protection, forcing you to throw a bomb at it to remove the shield, but this doesn't work too well and it's just far too easy to take it down, so it poses no real challenge. A concept that would have been much more interesting to see could have had Link fighting a corrupted version of all the champions and defeating them remove some curse they had placed upon them, or something in that realm of ideas. But again, most of the work went into creating Hyrule itself, and the dungeons are just one area where I think Tears of the Kingdom really improved upon its predecessor in every way. So you might remember how in the beginning of this video I said you could jump through a ring in the water in order to unlock a Korok seed? Well, now's the time to talk about their actual usage in the game, because these are extremely useful. Korok seeds are given to Link once you solve a very brief puzzle somewhere out in the overworld. This could be something like diving through a ring in the water, matching two metal structures together, or some other odd interaction with the Korok. These Korok seeds granted to Link allow him to upgrade either a shield, sword, or bow slot in the inventory, allowing him to carry more of whichever item you choose. You give these seeds to Hestu, who does a lovely little dance before upgrading the inventory via one slot. The more you choose to upgrade your inventory, the more Korok seeds are required, which adds great incentive to search these guys out, and considering there are literally 900 seeds to find throughout the game, it's pretty common to just stumble across them from time to time. So you should have a pretty hefty inventory by the end of the game. This system just instills even more curiosity and drive into the player by promising one of the most substantial rewards for using their brains and noticing one of these little puzzles floating around Hyrule. Now, if there's one thing I really dislike about Breath of the Wild, it would be the rain. Usually when it starts to rain in a video game, the atmosphere is very subdued and relaxing. Meanwhile, in Breath of the Wild, the main gimmick of the game, climbing, is made near impossible under any sort of rainfall. It would have been one thing if the rain just slightly halted your momentum, but making it basically just flat out undoable is just pushing it too far. You either have to build a campfire to sleep in or spend rupees to sleep at an inn, but who wants to do that? That is a total immersion breaker and a shame because the rain could have created a calming atmosphere, when instead it just grinds the game to a halt. Granted, if you have Rivali's Gale, this is made much easier, but nonetheless it's still a tedious nightmare whenever you're trying to scale a large cliff and it starts to rain. Speaking of Rivali's Gale, this is one of the 4 champion abilities you earn for completing a Divine Beast. These 4 abilities include Mipha's Grace, Urbosa's Fury, Daruk's Protection, and Rivali's Gale. I like these abilities much more than the ones seen in Tears of the Kingdom, mainly because these seem to fit the world much better. Using Rivali's Gale to fly up a large mountain is extremely useful, and since you can only use this 3 times before it needs to recharge, it never becomes a cheat, rather a reward for saving it up until you really need it. Urbosa's Fury comes in handy whenever you need to take an enemy out that's out of your reach. Daruk's Protection grants Link a shield which counters everything and can be used 3 times. And finally, Mipha's Grace acts like a much more powerful version of a fairy, fully recovering all of Link's health and adding temporary hearts on top of that. All the champions' abilities lend the player more tools to play around with in this world, and it could cause some people like myself to be more daring and attempt more difficult challenges because of the new tools added to Link's arsenal. One supremely underwhelming aspect of this game is the side quests. They aren't bad per se, but 90% of them involve something as little as collecting mushrooms or any other minor item. And while these smaller side quests are nothing special, I can't say the same for the larger quests. I'm mainly talking about the Hylian Homeowner and Terrytown missions. In order to even begin Terrytown, you need to have at least finished the Hylian Homeowner side quest, which is just great. You can literally build a house for Link, or at least pay these guys to do it, and the end result pays off in spades. In order to build this house, you need a few thousand rupees and a lot of wood. Gathering this wood in particular can become pretty tedious after a short amount of time, but it's totally worth it because once you do this, you get a house and a bed to sleep in whenever you want to for free. But the best part about all of this is that you can upgrade the house from being extremely bland and basic to containing tons of little trinkets such as the weapon holders which allow you to do just that. This is very nice, especially when you get the champion's weapons, because now you can have a safe place to store them without worrying about breaking each one. And this leads straight into Terrytown, which is my favorite side quest of the entire Zelda franchise. What makes this so great is the execution. Sure, it sucks having to gather more wood, but having to travel to the different regions of the game in search of whoever Hudson requests is very comforting. There's a certain feeling of satisfaction I get whenever I watch one of these characters walk away and towards Terrytown, because each time you return to Hudson for the next task, you'll see a subtle change in the town along with the brilliant touch of the music changing ever so slightly to include the main instruments of each race you send to the place. This all culminates in Hudson marrying the Gerudo who started tailoring his clothes, which wraps his whole quest up into one very nice bow. Another important mission in the game is lighting up the way to the ancient tech labs using blue fire from a torch. This is fine the first time around, but Robbie's tech lab can usually be pretty frustrating and tedious. Especially if it rains, which it tends to do here a lot. That's when you just glitch the game into letting you run and glide with the torch so you can fly on over there. It's totally worth it to do this though, because then you unlock the ability to purchase several types of ancient weapons, along with the Guardian armor, which comes in great handy when fighting them. This is one of the best aspects to Breath of the Wild, that being the fact that every single little task you complete will end up being rewarded in some way, even if it's just something small. It adds so much content to the game that it blows my mind every time I play it. Another thing that blows my mind is how the ending is handled. The fact that you can just storm into Hyrule Castle and literally take on Ganon right from the start of the game is insane. The developers knew most people wouldn't be able to actually pull this off, but leaving it as an option was still a great choice because at literally any point in the game, if you feel like fighting Ganon, you totally can. Nothing will try to say you can't. The most rewarding way to do this, however, is by exploring the world, finishing the Divine Beasts, and just decking Link out with powerful equipment so that he can obliterate anything on his way to Ganon. The finale is completely in the hands of the player, as it can be as easy or difficult as you want it to be. If you took the time to complete each of the 4 Divine Beasts, then they will instantly remove half of Ganon's health bar, which could be up for debate on whether this is a good or bad thing. I don't particularly think it was necessary to remove so much of the challenge, but at the same time, this helps speed up following playthroughs, leading to a less tedious experience. The fight with Calamity Ganon himself is pretty easy, but still neat from a spectacle point of view. I particularly like how in the second phase, you have to parry the lasers back at him in order to remove his invincibility. However, as said by numerous people, Dark Beast Ganon is a complete joke. But you know what, I'm okay with this, because the atmosphere is completely unmatched anywhere else in the series, with the exception of the dragon fight from Tears of the Kingdom. The fight against Dark Beast Ganon more so functions as a glorified cutscene for the game to end off on. All you need to do is shoot the glowing points on his body, and then shoot the giant eyeball on his head to destroy him. What I love about Breath of the Wild is that this game is much more about the journey rather than the destination. The fun in this game comes from the complete freedom on offer to the player, and the choice to do whatever you want, whenever you desire. This game revolutionized the open world genre, and since then we have had countless attempts by other studios to create something as magical as this experience. But in reality, nothing has ever even come close to being on par with Breath of the Wild. The sheer amount of curiosity this game exudes while playing it is unmatched in any other video game I have ever played, and I have never been so enamored with the world and its environment quite like I am with Breath of the Wild. The Zelda team really delivered something special with this entry, so here's to a long and prosperous future of this outstanding franchise, and I can only hope Nintendo never forgets what made this experience so special and why millions of people will forever hold this game fondly in their hearts. Ever since the release of Breath of the Wild back in 2017, the Zelda franchise has completely transformed. It broke away heavily from the more linear approach to the progression as seen in most games up to that point, and clearly this worked immensely. To this day, Breath of the Wild remains as possibly the most influential game of all time, at least for the open world genre, and due to its overwhelming success as the highest selling Zelda game by a long shot, of course Nintendo planned on creating a sequel to this beautiful masterpiece. But that's just the thing. How could it be possible to top one of the greatest games of all time? Well, what if I told you this is exactly what happened with The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom? After a beautifully shot intro, Link finds himself on Great Sky Island, which functions much like the Great Plateau from before. It is here where the constructs are introduced as a brand new enemy, and trust me, there are lots more to talk about. These constructs aren't very difficult, especially these earlier ones, which function more to get the player accustomed to the new technology and equipment they will be using across their journey. Speaking of which, the biggest addition this time around is Link's new arm. As seen in one of the early cutscenes, Link's right arm becomes corrupted by gloom, and Rauru replaces it with a highly advanced Zonai arm, which grants Link multiple abilities. On Great Sky Island, there are numerous shrines which must be completed in order to unlock these abilities, and just like the Great Plateau with its runes, you can't leave this area until Link's arm is nearing its full potential. This location is much more difficult than the Great Plateau, mainly because rather than before, the path to each shrine is much more intricate and cleverly designed, and that speaks to this game as a whole. Nintendo definitely expected you to play Breath of the Wild before this one, as Tears of the Kingdom is much more challenging in every way. For example, you can still cook spicy peppers to survive the freezing weather, but now you can't just walk directly to the snowy area. Instead, the player is forced to learn some of the fusing mechanics by constructing a boat made of wooden planks and fans, because the water beneath you drains all of Link's stamina if he falls in. There is a plethora of things to discover and explore just on Great Sky Island alone. I spent over 3 hours just in this location before I got to progress the game any further. I spent tons of time just playing around with Link's new abilities, which, as mentioned earlier, are granted to you after completing all the necessary shrines required for each upgrade. The most prominent utility of this new arm is Ultra Hand. This is very much this game's equivalent to Magnesis, except now you can pick up almost anything. It doesn't just have to be metal like before. This is how you solve most of the puzzles and shrines throughout the world. However, the rest of these new abilities include Fuse, Recall, Ascend, and Auto Build. That last one isn't unlocked until quite a bit later though, but I'll still touch upon it here. Fusing essentially allows Link to combine any object he wants with his current weapon, shield, or arrow. For example, if you defeat an enemy, you can use their horns or other parts to fuse it together with your sword. This is one of the only ways to get powerful weapons in the game, and I will say this is one of my biggest criticisms of the game. In Breath of the Wild, I would always get excited whenever a higher class weapon would drop, or I would find it laying around in Hyrule Castle. But in Tears of the Kingdom, most weapons are decayed, which means they hardly inflict any real damage upon enemies. That's why the fusing mechanic is set in place, as it forces the player to be creative in how they go about defeating enemies. This obviously serves to make the game much harder, but it also takes away a lot of the magic when you find a previously powerful weapon, which can now only do single digits worth of damage unless it's fused together with a powerful object. One of the other main abilities of Link's arm is Recall, and this one is really fun to use. This causes any item you choose to reverse its movements, and let me tell you, this can be used to cheese so many puzzles. And on top of that, you can also use it to send objects very high into the sky, which gives you a chance to survey the area for any inconspicuous secrets. My personal favorite addition is Ascend. Simply stand under any viable surface and you can literally jump up and through it to the other side. This is put heavily into use the later you progress through the game, and the animation while using it is just so satisfying. Auto build isn't unlocked until much later, but this allows Link to build any object he wants at a moment's notice, as long as he has a scheme of stones to do so. These stones can either be found in numerous locations or are just given to Link through story progression. While this is a really cool ability, I just didn't find myself using it all too much, which is why it's my least favorite tool in Link's arsenal. After every shrine containing these Zonai mechanics are completed, you're able to open up this giant door and officially start the game proper. The second you land in this water, the adventure truly begins. Right away you'll notice that you aren't handed the paraglider immediately. You actually need to venture into town to this little place called Lookout Landing. This is where you are tasked with making your way through the outside of the bottom portion of Hyrule Castle to retrieve some data necessary for progression. And yes, I said bottom half. This game's main feature is obviously that it takes place both on the land and in the sky, so you can't even reach the main section of Hyrule Castle yet since it's so high up. Anyways, once you have obtained the required information, Purah, who's actually all grown up now, will give Link the paraglider, which also leads directly into the new function for towers. Now once you find a tower, like before, there is a small puzzle that you need to solve in order to gain access to it. But they feel even greater to unlock now because once you examine them, Link will be launched into the sky, and I mean launched. This is why the towers are so satisfying to uncover, because not only do you have a great new warp point, but now you can glide to wherever you need, so long as you have the stamina to do so. Or you could do what I did, which was cook up a bunch of stamina dishes and make my way over to the floating Hyrule Castle immediately so I could get the Hylian Shield. If you thought Breath of the Wild's world was big, well, Tears of the Kingdom is literally 3 times the size of before. Obviously we have the absolutely massive world of Hyrule, but now there's the sky as mentioned earlier, and the depths, which is essentially another Hyrule lurking underneath the ground, shrouded in complete darkness. This is much more enjoyable to explore in my opinion because at times, the sky can seem pretty barren. It honestly reminds me of a better version of Skyward Sword's overworld. Obviously there's much more to do in Tears of the Kingdom sky, but oftentimes I found myself landing on a platform with little more than a machine or fairies on it. However, the depths bring an incredibly unique feeling of mystery to the game. This is something which has never been even close to a concept in any other Zelda game, and it truly feels like you're entering a new dimension when you travel down here. The eerie music and all the corrupted enemies make this place feel genuinely terrifying. The only way to see anything down here is by throwing a bright bloom seed or finding a light root, which acts as a sort of shrine with no puzzle. They do light up the entire perimeter once interacted with, and this drives greater incentive to find all these light roots because in doing so, the world becomes more visible, thus making it easier to explore. It's very easy to spend hours upon hours exploring this place, and there were times where I became so invested with this alien-like underworld that I completely forgot that the massive Hyrule Kingdom was right above me. One item that can only be found in the depths are the Poes. So yeah, Poes make a return in this game, but not how you'd expect. You don't fight them like in Ocarina of Time. They now have been turned into a collectible which can be exchanged for numerous items. However, the Dark Link set is definitely the main attraction here. One of the most prominent complaints about Breath of the Wild was the lack of enemy variety seen throughout Hyrule. And personally, I never had an issue with those enemies considering how engaging and enjoyable most of them were to fight. However, after playing the sequel, I can totally see why people clamored for a wider selection of enemies to face. This game has by far the biggest enemy count in any Zelda game ever, multiple times over. Every old enemy returns, but on top of that you can find a lot of the older Zelda enemies now, which look incredible with this game's art style. Most of these even have much more advanced movesets than they did in the past. For example, Gibdos can now fly and crawl, and they also can't be defeated easily with a sword like in Majora's Mask. Like-likes were another fan favorite enemy that return in an enormous variety. Now I've got shock like-likes, ice and fire like-likes, and corrupted like-likes. But that's not even scratching the surface of the new additions. There are now boss bokoblins, which walk around certain areas of the map with a bunch of normal bokoblins trailing behind. This adds even more personality to the world than it already had in Breath of the Wild, and it's simply astonishing. You will literally run into a new monster to fight around every single corner of Hyrule. There's also new overworld bosses, with the best one being the Gleeoks, which are these 3-headed dragons, and yeah, these are incredibly hard to defeat. And who could forget the most terrifying enemy of all time, the Gloom Hands. These things nearly gave me a heart attack the first time I saw them chasing after me, with that creepy music playing in the background. It's impossible to become bored in this world because there will always be something mysterious or interesting just a few steps away. My absolute favorite part of Tears of the Kingdom is that this does not feel like a generic copy and paste of Breath of the Wild's Hyrule. These two games build so well off each other as you can travel anywhere, such as Kakariko Village or Hateno Village, and you will see progression. Any concerns about this game not progressing the world of Hyrule further than it was in Breath of the Wild should be immediately dismissed. I was so invested in traveling to all the old places just to see how they look now, and what new advancements have been made upon them. For example, Kakariko Village is now surrounded by structures and floating rings, while Hateno Village now has a mare and a greater emphasis on mushrooms. They even put a mushroom on the goddess statue's head. How cute. Or all the main regions such as Rito Village are now plagued by some phenomena. But my personal favorite is seeing the progression of Terry Town from this quaint little village you helped establish in the previous game to this giant sprawling city with an entire railcard system just to get you from one level to another. It's also greatly appreciated how everyone you meet in Breath of the Wild recognizes you now. Link himself went from a lonely knight to a world-renowned hero. The whole story and world is cohesive and perfectly displays how towns and locations along with characters have changed within the last few years. Something I found quite surprising is that Nintendo actually decided to go with an awkward number with something for once, that being the shrines. There aren't 120 of these anymore, now there are 152. There are shrines in the sky as well as the surface, and these are very different from Breath of the Wild shrines. Now it seems like almost every shrine can only be completed if some sort of contraption or something is built. Some of these can be extremely tough, as I definitely struggled more on these shrines than I did on the previous ones. You can't easily breeze through most of these like before. Now you actually need to pay full attention to what you're constructing in order for completion to be an option. They really went above and beyond with these shrines, and the vibe they give off is just so incredible. In Breath of the Wild, the shrines felt like they took place simply underground, and I get that was the point. But now when you enter a shrine, it feels like you're being teleported to the distant past in order to pass one of these trials. The whole Zonai vibe is really unique and sets an atmosphere unlike any other Zelda game before it. Completing these shrines reward the player with light blessings, which are the exact equivalent to spirit orbs from before. Collecting 4 of these will grant Link the option to expand either his hearts or his stamina gauge. This time around, however, I'd say it's much more important to emphasize stamina over hearts, at least until you get 2 full stamina rings, as that's due to a few good reasons. First off, this is by far the most vertical Zelda game. There are tons of high places that will be much more manageable if you just carry a lot of stamina on you. But the most important reason is because the Master Sword actually requires Link to have 2 full rings of stamina as opposed to 13 hearts like before. Plus, you can always trade your stamina for hearts with the demon statue once you take the Master Sword. Remember how everyone hated the Divine Beasts? Well, Nintendo answered back strongly, to say the least. There are now actual temples that are unlocked after completing each of the 4 regional phenomena around Hyrule. These phenomena are incredibly cool. Each race has its own unique problem, but the way they are handled here is so interesting. Rito Village is freezing and set under an endless blizzard which threatens the food supply for the village. Goron City's food has been corrupted, placing them under some sort of mind control. Zora's domain is constantly being invaded by sludge, which muddies up their water and makes it unlivable. And lastly, Gerudo Town has been infested by Gibdos, forcing them to live in an underground bunker for shelter. These all set Link on a very strong quest to solve riddles and uncover mysteries around the world, which all eventually lead to the discoveries of the temples. The 4 main temples include the Water Temple, Fire Temple, Lightning Temple, and Wind Temple. And while these names may seem very basic, the dungeons themselves certainly aren't, and they all take place in separate locations. For example, the Fire Temple takes place in the depths, while the Wind Temple is found way up in the highest point of the sky. Thematically, these are all extremely cool, with very intriguing puzzles which can be genuinely challenging to solve. It's nice to see older elements return to this game, such as the usage of mirrors in the Lightning Temple. If you played Ocarina of Time, this dungeon will instantly be recognizable due to all the puzzles bearing a striking resemblance to that game's Spirit Temple, which is an all-time favorite for many. The most enjoyable temple in the game for me was the Wind Temple. The atmosphere is amazing here. While you have to climb extremely high into the sky, only to see this floating boat surrounded by powerful wind, and once Link actually boards the dungeon, and all you see is floating platforms engulfed in hurricane-like weather, you get this really strong feeling of isolation, like all of the civilization is far below you on the surface, and here you are trapped inside this little area. It's such a different vibe given off from any other dungeon in the Zelda series, so to me it was extremely refreshing. And the bosses are amazing too. None of these resemble each other at all, unlike the Blights from before. These are much more like traditional Zelda bosses that feel like they're straight out of Link to the Past or Skyward Sword. And completing these temples grants Link with a new ability gifted to him from the Sage of that respective element. These are much like the champion abilities except modified to fit this game's new world design. Take Tulin's Wind for example. Since most platforms and Tears of the Kingdom are very far apart, this functions as a horizontal version of Rivali's Gale, but it charges much faster and gets Link to his destination much quicker. These abilities are all great, but I can't help but miss some of the older champions' powers such as Urbosa's Fury or Daruk's Protection. The substitute for Urbosa's Fury is alright, but not that great, especially compared to what we had before. However, one thing I will say is how cool it is that all the sages in this game We're just ordinary people in Breath of the Wild. They're all given much greater roles now, and they play such an integral position in the story. There's one secret temple, though, which also takes place in the depths, that being the Construct Factory. And I wanted to save this one for last because it's definitely the most unique of the bunch. I'm not gonna lie, this dungeon got me on edge from time to time, mainly because of how long it is. You start off by assembling a body for Minoru, the Zonai Sage of Spirit, so her soul can manifest itself inside the robot. You do this by traveling to the arm and leg depots, which then requires some sort of mini-challenge to carry this device back to Minoru in order to assemble the body. These sections can actually be a lot of fun because there's an even heavier emphasis on building and fusing here. You'll have to build cars to drive through lava or gloom, planes to fly long distances, or build some other creative device to progress through the dungeon. But my problem lies after the completion of this section and the new bodies assembled. You're now able to ride on this giant robot, but it's extremely slow unless you attach a fan to its back, but even then, the battery runs out far too fast and really gets anywhere with it. And on top of that, some of the hardest enemies in the game are placed directly in the path, which can just turn into a slog when you're trying to travel long distances to proceed through the game. But either way, once you finish this part, there's actually a really fun boss fight with a corrupted construct where you basically have to use an item to stun it, then whack it with a giant spike ball a few times until it flies into the ropes of the arena. This is definitely one of the most memorable boss fights in the entire series, whether that be for the better or worse. So just like in Breath of the Wild, you can find memories scattered throughout the land of Hyrule, except this time, they take the form of dragon tears instead. And while this is a very big step up from before, Tears of the Kingdom had an absolutely amazing story with so many plot elements, it's insane for a Zelda game. The cinematics at play are nothing short of breathtaking at times. The visuals are absolutely stunning like you see here, but even when there isn't much going on, you get some much needed context of who the Zonai are, and how they were defeated back in their timeline. Something these memories do better than the previous game is fleshing out Princess Zelda in a whole new way. This time we get to see her fascination with the Zonai, and how attached she grows to all of them. These cutscenes really portray Zelda in a selfless and caring way, like she really wants to help everyone no matter what she has to sacrifice. They also show how much she cares about Link. It's actually quite heartwarming to see her talking so confidently about him to everyone she encounters. This game also sees the return of the Demon King Ganondorf, and this is by far the best looking design of Ganondorf yet. The beautiful art style meshes so well with his design and just makes him look even more threatening than before. But even better than that, Ganondorf's character is simply brilliant this time around. He isn't just a mindless beast or someone who sits on a throne doing nothing like in Twilight Princess. No, he is seriously terrifying, everything from his confidence to his intentions. He actually has a plan and is fully prepared to face Link once the time is right. Ganondorf is super entertaining, and every second he's on screen, the player is treated to some of the most intriguing moments of the entire game. Okay, so what about the music in this game? Well, I've always been a huge fan of Breath of the Wild's more subdued themes, and I especially love how the piano takes the forefront most of the time. In Tears of the Kingdom, much of the same instrumentation is used, and lots of themes return such as the village themes, but the new tracks are simply gorgeous. The shrine music is so otherworldly and serene, really making you feel like Link is in a totally different dimension. The tower music is a happy little tune that makes you feel like you are safe from all harm, almost like it's telling the player to just take a break and soak in the beautiful environment. Lookout Landing feels very friendly, which matches the personalities of all the characters here perfectly. And the temple themes are amazing as usual. I'm also particularly thankful that they didn't just reuse the old overworld themes from Breath of the Wild, because while I love those, it's definitely nice to have a new addition considering you spend most of your time in the overworld. Unfortunately, the outdated hardware of the Nintendo Switch holds this game back from reaching its full potential. It does perform better than Breath of the Wild for the most case, perhaps due to the fact that this time around, the developers weren't shackled to the Wii U's limitation, so they were able to craft a more stable experience made solely for the Switch. With that being said, the frame rate still tanks hard in some areas, such as the Water Temple. This was completely unacceptable, and it made the boss fight very egregious and time-consuming. As far as graphics go, this game, like its predecessor, is simply gorgeous. It feels like there was even more work put into the lighting system. And there are times where I simply have to take a breath and admire the environment. Nintendo was very smart with their decision to make this game cel-shaded, and similar to the Wind Waker, the unique art style they chose will certainly stand the test of time for years to come. Opting for a more stylized world has paved the way for some of the best character and enemy designs in the series. Everyone and everything is just full to the brim with personality, which helps to flesh out the world even more. Even the side quests are much more involved than Breath of the Wild's were. Rather than being asked to fetch a certain amount of a specific item, like 50 rush rooms, most quests see Link actually helping cities or towns on a larger scale. Don't get me wrong, there's still the typical fetch quests like before, however those are few and far between, and what we have now is equal parts rewarding and satisfying to pull off. One quest that really stood out to me involved handing out mushrooms to the citizens of Hateno Village in order to secure Cece the position as mayor. This questline was so great because of how involved it is, and how much you learn about each character. After giving them all mushrooms, you need to help them out with their own individual problems, which eventually leads to a heartwarming conclusion as to how the village will be managed. And not only that, but the reward for doing so is much more than worth it, as Cece can repair the Hylian shield whenever it shatters, if you pay her enough rupees. So this also gives the player an incentive to use the shield more often, considering how easily it can be repaired if you have the necessary amount of rupees. Oh, and something else you can do after this side quest is unlock the ability to pull Link's hood down, which is actually pretty annoying because you'd think this would be an option in the menu, but no, you have to travel all the way to Hateno Village just to do something Link could easily do himself. But I digress. In case you were wondering, Korok seeds do indeed return for the sequel, and they function in the exact same ways they did before. And this time, there's around 1,000 of these seeds scattered around Hyrule, perhaps to give the player something else to find throughout the Sky Islands, but in the end, simply giving these to Hestu will give the option to upgrade either the weapon, bow, or shield slot, but it's all worth it just for the new dance alone. I mean, just look at this. In Tears of the Kingdom, many things such as the Great Fairies have been completely changed. This time, they don't require rupees, but a specific instrument must be played by an NPC to make them emerge from their hiding. But this concept of change applies to much more than just the Great Fairies. In order to reach Korok Forest, there's no need to follow the light given off by a torch, but instead you have to navigate through the depths, which can be quite tricky in order to find the proper platform to ascend on, thus bringing you to the forest. And this highlights another one of my favorite aspects of the game, that being the music played before fixing the problems in each region, along with the Korok Forest. This adds insanely good atmosphere to each of these locations, and it makes them all feel truly deserted or in grave danger. I also love how in this game Zelda is on a completely separate adventure from Link. She travels back in time only to discover the Zonai, and that they were actually the founders of Hyrule, thus deeming them the first king and queen of the land. Zelda is extremely concerned about her future and spends most of her time trying to figure out a way to make it back to her timeline in order to help Link stop Ganondorf. And that twist where she eats the secret stone, which turns her into her dragon, is very heart-wrenching, as it is stated multiple times that she will never be able to turn back to her Hylian self after consuming the stone and transforming into the dragon. This makes you feel even lonelier as Link, because he just lost one of the last physical lines of support he had. And that just serves to make the sages even more impactful, as they are basically what the champions would have been to Link if they never died 100 years ago in the Calamity. This game is truly something special, and it's near impossible to put into words just how enjoyable of an experience this really is. You hold the entire world in the grasp of your own hands, and as a player you are given the freedom to craft a playthrough in whichever way you want. Unlike the traditional Zelda games, the world does not open up by uncovering items such as the boomerang or hookshot, but instead this entire beautiful and open world is available to explore right from the start. And as such, this means you can make the game as easy or hard as you want. If you choose to start the game off immediately hunting down shrines, chances are the game will be much easier for you due to the amount of hearts and stamina Link will end up possessing by the end of your shrine hunting. The amount of freedom on offer in Tears of the Kingdom is unlike any other game, and it will likely remain like that for decades to come. There is nothing you can't do here. If you decide to try something out, you will never be turned down by the game, rather your own lack of materials and equipment to proceed. And even in those cases, there are still tons of workarounds to make it through puzzles or enemy encounters successfully. All it takes is a little bit of problem solving skills, and you can do pretty much anything you want in this entire massive world. You can even find Master Koga lurking beneath the depths of Hyrule. And this time, it's not even required to beat him in order to unlock any dungeons. In fact, this is literally considered a side adventure by the developers, which lends even more freedom to that we already had in Breath of the Wild. And on the subject of the Yiga clan, I think it's incredibly fitting that they are found almost exclusively in the depths now, rather than Hyrule Kingdom. This just frees up even more space for new and exciting enemies to fill up the surface world, and some players may go the entire game without even knowing the Yiga clan is returned from Breath of the Wild. One feature that I'm very surprised was added to this game is all the DLC from before being brought back for Tears of the Kingdom, and some of it is even expanded upon. For example, now you can find the travel medallion in-game, but not only that, you can literally get 3 of these things now, which are massively useful, especially in this game where there are 3 separate overworlds. The hero's path is also unlockable, which, as before, allows the player to see every step and path they've taken up to their current location. It's stuff like this that Nintendo easily could have skipped out on, or put them inside some sort of paid DLC like before, but clearly they wanted to maximize this game's potential by granting all of these tools to the player, so long as you're willing to go out of the way to find them for yourselves. The way they've expanded among concepts from Breath of the Wild is simply astonishing. When people like to say this game makes the predecessor seem like a tech demo, it's not hard to see why. For example, remember the labyrinths from before? Well, those now contain 2 parts each, so if you thought they were long in Breath of the Wild, think again, as each one in Tears of the Kingdom requires Link to finish the bottom maze first, which then unlocks access to the maze floating up in the sky. And even completing that isn't enough, for Link must then prove his courage by diving into the depths and fighting a flux construct. These can be incredibly tough if you don't know what you're doing, or if you have weak weapons. These pretty much require the full utility of Link's arm in order to defeat them normally. And the first one I ever faced gave me such a hard time that I literally gave up and came back for it later, only to defeat it and leave its parts on the floor, which I soon came to find out are one of the most powerful fuses in the game. So that was quite a depressing loss. The Thunderhead was another area which really piqued my interest at first. It works kind of like it did in Skyward Sword, however it is much more intricate and complicated now. For starters, to even clear this place up, you need to get this unique piece of clothing, which causes the statues to open up the path through Thunderhead. This section can be pretty tough and it offers no hand-holding at all. So finding your way through this place can be quite the daunting task if you're not prepared. Completing this is also necessary to finding the 5th stage, Minoru. This game really does place a heavy emphasis on storytelling, and I think it pulls it off seamlessly. Literally everything connects itself to each other through gameplay in some way, so it strikes this beautiful balance between in-game discoveries and ascertained information found throughout cutscenes and world building. Something I'd like to point out is Link's design in this game. In my opinion, this is by far the coolest and most stylish Link out of the whole series. His arm only makes him look tougher and gives the appearance that he's been fighting monsters for quite some time. And his hair is also long and grown out, symbolizing growth in his character, along with the Zonai tattoos reaching up to his chest. Character design has always been very important in any video game, especially when it's the character the player is directly controlling. It's for those reasons that Ocarina of Time is a third-person game, because the designer for Link thought it would be a waste to throw Link into a first-person perspective, where the player never gets to see how detailed and unique his design is. I completely agree with this sentiment, as I feel like being able to see your character adds much more immersion to video games because it draws the player closer to the game. It makes them feel more immersed in the story and world. It's also like you're spending time with the character, getting to learn their quirks, strengths, weaknesses, and overall personalities. This is why Link from the Wind Waker will always be one of the most beloved video game characters out there. The simple act of portraying emotion through body language, facial expressions, clothes, and other accessories is what helps shape characters into their fascinating legacies. And this extends to other citizens that Link meets throughout the way. The art design really does these characters justice, and as every single one of them has such diverse personalities which makes them stand out from one another. Even Link himself has an entirely distinct personality even though he never talks. Each reincarnation of Link seems to take on some type of different defining traits from one another. For example, in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Link is more serious and seems to mess around much less, even though that is likely due to the Nintendo 64's limited power. But immediately after that we are gifted with Toon Link from the Wind Waker, which I mean, come on, is literally one of the most charming creations to ever come out of a video game. Meanwhile, Link from Twilight Princess is very stoic and heroic, and he's obviously portrayed as the most physically powerful in the series. That's one of the best parts about the Zelda franchise. It constantly strives to innovate on all levels, including art direction and character design. And by doing this, Nintendo has already created one of the most influential and unique pieces of gaming in history. If I could use one word to summarize Tears of the Kingdom, it would simply be overwhelming. This game throws so much stuff at you right from the start, which can either be a very good thing or turn you away from the game entirely. I can't believe there was a time when Breath of the Wild was considered huge, because while it certainly is, the sequel can be genuinely terrifying to newer players of the franchise. My advice for anyone struggling to get into this game would simply be patience. That right there is a key word when considering Tears of the Kingdom as a whole. This game can not just be enjoyed with a narrow mindset or lack of an attention span. With time, the world fleshes itself out, and even though it may take a while, all the effort put into advancing the story and building Link into this powerful warrior is more than worth it. Now I wanted to dedicate an entire section to this game's climax because oh boy, does this game have quite the ending. Previously, you only really had to reach the Sanctum of Hyrule Castle in order to fight Ganon, but things are totally different this time around. While it is still very much possible to rush straight down to Ganondorf, it is near impossible to come out victorious if you aren't fully prepared, and I mean fully prepared. You better have tackled plenty of shrines and gained tons of hearts and stamina vessels if you even want to stand a chance in the endgame, honestly. First off, you need to infiltrate Hyrule Castle and pursue Zelda as she constantly teleports around. But very quickly you'll start to realize something's off. Her voice doesn't sound quite like herself, which I thought was a very nice touch. You can quite clearly tell that this is a fraud, especially with the things she says and how she says them. And if you found all the memories before doing this, you'll already be aware that this is not the real Zelda, but a fake, puppet version of the princess created by Ganondorf to fool Link into going to Hyrule Castle to be taken out. This obviously works as Link is lured right into the Sanctum again, but instead of fighting the final boss here, you fight Phantom Ganon for the second time. This is such a cool fight, and it just goes to show how great of a decision it was by Nintendo to actually create unique encounters rather than facing off against 4 very similar blights. This is also quite difficult too, especially with all the gloom covering most of the floor space. And what gloom does is it cracks Link's hearts, essentially making it impossible to recover any health by eating foods. In fact, one of the only ways to recover damage inflicted by gloom is by eating any dish that was cooked with Sundelions. That mechanic right there is what gave me most of my trouble throughout the game, and even more so here in the end. Fighting Phantom Ganon also feels quite climatic because it really feels like the first phase of a long boss battle, but in reality, this was basically just a teaser for what's to come, which I thought was executed perfectly because I certainly did not expect what would happen next. After defeating Phantom Ganon, Purah explains how there must be a 5th stage somewhere and that's it. There's literally no direction given off to the player, as you really are forced to search this stage out by yourself. Well, it turns out there's a secret dungeon which must be completed, and upon finishing it and discovering the 5th stage, you're directed back to Lookout Landing, where you're then put on the path to fighting the real Ganondorf this time, not just his puppet. Something that was very unexpected for me was that in order to reach Ganon, you do not have to travel to the skies like most people probably would have expected since, you know, that was the main selling point of the game. It only seemed likely that Link would face off with him in the elevated Hyrule Castle. But no, the devs were aware that there were already an intense boss fight up there waiting for the player in Phantom Ganon. So the true path is down in the depths below Hyrule Castle, which is just phenomenal when looking at the atmosphere it provides. This place is genuinely terrifying, and you feel even more alone than at any other point in the game by a long shot. The enemies down here are absolutely ruthless, and due to the abundance of gloom in every room, you'll likely lose the ability to recover lots of hearts unless you remember to cook lots of dishes with Sundelions in preparation, which I can safely say I definitely did not do. I highly underestimated how difficult this part of the game would be. This is by far the hardest ending in any Zelda game and will no doubt take players multiple tries to clear. Once reaching a certain point, you're faced with this really fun section which reminds me a lot of Skyward Sword's ending, where you had to cut down hundreds of bokoblins on your way down to rescue Zelda. It's neat that Nintendo looked all the way back at the first canonical game of the franchise and decided to take a mechanic from it and implement it here. It really just ties the whole series together into this beautiful bow, and it feels just as exhilarating as it did before. Luckily, the sages are here to help you fight off the enemies, but this section does go on for a very long time, with tougher enemies spawning in after each phase. This part of the game is probably the most successful at showing how powerful Link has become. He now fights besides the power of 5 other sages and wields the most powerful sword in the series. But all of this is just a mere warm-up for what's to come afterwards. This is where the true confrontation with Ganon draws close. As all the other stages split off from Link to fight off the rest of the baddies, you just have to walk down this eerie hallway filled with gloom, and this just lends even more atmosphere to an already stellar ending. Now this cutscene here really displays how desperate and relentless Ganondorf actually is. He's certainly the most violent of all the previous Ganons, which leads to a very tense boss fight. The first phase is relatively simple, sort of mirroring Phantom Ganon's fight from earlier, except this time is much more difficult due to the amount of damage he inflicts, and since the sages aren't here to help, this can actually be pretty tough if you aren't careful. But phase 2, this is where things really amp up in difficulty. My jaw absolutely dropped when I saw that health bar literally fill up the entire right side of the screen. It was just terrifying. This phase took me several attempts to pull off. It can be hard to keep your focus on the real Ganondorf because of all the fake ones constantly getting in the way, making it very disorientating at times, which in turn leads to lots of damage inflicted upon Link. Which, let me say once again, can be very hard to recover from due to gloom only being curable with certain foods. As tough as this battle may be, I do love it for its intense atmosphere and clever use of spatial surroundings designed to knock the player off balance. The third and final phase is back to just Link and Ganondorf, no sages and no phantoms. And if you don't understand the gimmick here, well, good luck defeating him because it will never happen unless you realize that it is not good enough to just flurry rush him once because he will counter it with his own flurry rush. What actually needs to happen is Link needs to flurry rush Ganon's flurry rush in order to cause any meaningful damage to him. And this can be quite difficult because he switches weapon types constantly, which can make it very hard to predict which move he's going to make next. However, defeating this final form causes Ganon to go into a panic, and he will actually eat his Sacred Stone, just like Zelda did. And you know what that means. Dragon Ganon, baby. Now this whole sequence functions a lot like the Dark Beast Ganon fight from before. It isn't very challenging and mainly serves the purpose of rewarding the player for defeating his earlier forms, and as such, this fight is absolutely breathtaking. The visuals are so clean and unlike anything seen throughout the rest of the game. Also, just the overall spectacle of this section is extremely exhilarating. Zelda in her dragon form flies Link around, and you must jump off and glide down to the demon dragon's weak point, which just feels so amazing to do. You really are chipping away the last remains of this immeasurable threat to Hyrule. However, the real treat is what comes once defeating the Draconified Demon King. The sages use their power to restore Link's arm, which just puts a beautiful ending to this saga. And I feel as though if this were the last Zelda game ever, it would be a perfect conclusion to the series. The story is just so perfectly executed and well thought out this time. But the best part is when Link, Rauru, and Sonia use their magic to revert Zelda back to her Hylian self. What comes next is just so unique for the Zelda franchise. For once, the ending is actually interactable, and this helps the game stand out even more than it already did. Gliding after Zelda and having to reach out to her yourself feels so perfect and gives off such a fitting end to this game's story and adventure. The cutscene that takes place afterwards is one of the best Zelda cutscenes ever in my opinion. It's super emotional to hear Zelda spill her heart out to Link, especially when she says that she's finally home, implying that her home is in Hyrule with Link. And as to be expected, if you collected all the memories in the game, there will be an extra cutscene which is far better than Breath of the Wild's true ending. Now we actually get to see Zelda achieve some sort of closure with her past and present failures. It's also nice that all the sages except Minoru survive, because it feels like there was more of a team effort in taking down Ganon, and the fact that they all made it out alive ensures Hyrule's safety in the future, well, at least until Ganon appears again. So in the end, is this game better than its predecessor? Well, frankly, that would be an unfair question considering how different these games are. You really can't have one without the other, and both of these titles just complement each other so well. As the player, you really get to see this incarnation of Link becoming stronger minute by minute throughout both games, and it just creates such a perfectly cohesive journey through this character's perspective. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom really is a video game equivalent to Freedom, and I fail to think of a way Nintendo could possibly one-up or even match this game. It was just such a huge accomplishment, and truly a landmark in game design. Everything from the building mechanics to the separate but very interconnected overworlds to the beautiful story truly make up an adventure unlike any other. It'll be very interesting to see which direction the Zelda series is taken in from here, but in my opinion, I believe this should be the last game with this iteration of Link and Zelda, because Ganon is completely gone, and the world is finally at peace. It's a blessing that this game was delayed for so many years, because without the necessary time, Tears of the Kingdom would doubtfully be the masterpiece we see before our eyes today. So there you have it, a retrospective on the entire 3D Zelda series. At the end of the day, this franchise is, and likely always will be, one of the greatest video game franchises of all time. Each title truly excels at creating stunning immersion and providing innovative gameplay. From Ocarina of Time to Tears of the Kingdom, every title stands out and exudes creativity in their own unique ways. So with all that being said, I've been Mr. Redman, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.